I felt peaceful and content as the soft waves gently wrapped around my feet. The beach was bright, and the sky was a beautiful azure with soft clouds skimming the sky on their way from nowhere to oblivion. In the background, palm trees stretched upward, slightly bent at the top, heavily laden with fruit. It was truly a tropical paradise. I laughed, watching the young maidens dancing around me in the lightest transparent satin. They teased me with their curves, their hidden treasures, their delicious smiles hinting at promises of what could happen if I could only pay them enough attention. I smiled back as I looked at each of the women, flawless in form and appearance. I enjoyed the feeling of a tropical drink, some type of pina colada in my hand, cold to the touch, with the aroma of pineapple and rum, the sweetness of which filled my nostrils, causing my mouth to water in anticipation of the first sip. The drink combined with the surroundings made me feel completely satisfied. I couldn't imagine a better place to be. Summer breeze, bright sunshine pouring down on us, tropical location. Perfect. I grinned as one of the lovely ladies walked gracefully through the ankle-deep water towards me, hinting at a possible tropical date. I smiled as she reached out to touch my cheek, and our eyes met. Her smile could make me submit to her every wish in the blink of an eye. For a moment, I wondered if she was the one. She was radiant, seductive, beautiful, elegant. We looked into each other's eyes. She came closer, just a few centimeters from me. I took a deep breath, waiting impatiently. Our lips were almost touching when suddenly, without warning, her expression twisted and she screamed in my face. I was instantly awake, the dream quickly slipping from my memory as I looked at the dark red LED display of my 20-year-old alarm clock. The time had to be adjusted every couple of months on this old thing, but it was a gift for my 5th birthday from my grandparents, so it had sentimental value even if it didn't tell the time accurately. 2:30 in the morning, perfect. I sighed, realizing that a couple of minutes ago, the same word had flashed through my head, but with a completely different meaning. I estimated that I had only been asleep for a little over 40 minutes when the scream of the woman in my dream echoed in reality, where the scream was a woman just 2 steps away from me. Groaning slightly, I threw back the blanket and sat up, trying to rub the sleep from my eyes. For a moment, I wondered how this substance called sleep could accumulate so quickly in the corners of my eyes, while I myself was lacking sleep. Her fleeting breath made me understand why I woke up so suddenly. Squinting, I looked at her. She looked at me with wide open eyes and continued to cry, looking at me pleadingly. I smiled at her. She paused for a moment, seeing my face in the dim light and the fact that I was smiling when our eyes met. But soon she again could not hold back her tears and began to cry again. I kept a tight smile on my face as I moved to hug her. For the next few minutes I continued to smile as she cried, her tears staining my hands as I held her until she calmed down. It was difficult for me to be so receptive, to hold so openly to someone whom I had never asked to share my room with, whom I was trying to love. I looked at my watch again and noticed that 15 minutes had passed since she woke me from my sleep. I must have been tired. I would have sworn that only 3 minutes had passed since I woke up. I heard her sniffle and looked at her again. Our eyes met again, and I felt something in me, those blue eyes, innocent and wide. She started crying again, now that I paid attention to her. Britney, another, was the sweetest, most adorable baby there could be. However, to me, Britney symbolized failure. On one hand, Britney was my crying infant daughter, just a few months old. Perfectly formed, with plump cheeks, those pink soft hands that grabbed everything they could get their hands on. She had deep blue eyes that had captured the hearts of everyone around me over the past month. The same people told me that her eyes are the same as mine, although mine are brown. Looking at her as she cried, I think if I squint hard enough, I could see it. I stood up, holding Britney in my arms as the nurses had indicated, making sure her head was supported, and slowly walked towards my bedroom door. I could already smell the diaper, knowing that was what woke her up. Everyone told me it would get easier, that being a dad was hard, and that I could cope, but the reality was that I didn't want it. I didn't want the responsibility. I didn't want it. I turned on the bathroom light and placed her on the changing table my parents bought for me. When I turned my daughter around, she stopped crying. The movement made her wonder what was going on. I coughed as I undid the fastenings on the diaper, again wondering how someone who only drinks formula from a bottle could produce something that probably rivals the waste coming out of a nuclear reactor. I cleaned Britney, and she hooted as I wrapped her tightly again before taking her to the kitchen and warming up the bottle. I'm already good at doing things with one hand. Mixture in bottle, water, shake. Then a quick visit to the microwave, and finally a check on the wrist to make sure the temperature is correct. With Britney nestled on my chest, I moved from the kitchen into my small living room and sat down on my old second-hand couch. The faded brown material was slightly cool, but a little uncomfortable due to years of wear and tear, much of which occurred before I bought it. Nestled in my arms, Britney gratefully accepted the bottle and immediately began sucking. She sucked the mixture as long as she could and looked deep into my eyes. Yes, I was thinking. Britney had my eyes and my nose, but she also had her mother's chin. What was even worse was that even as a baby, Britney had that woman's lips. I involuntarily shuddered, trying not to think, not to return to those memories. Britney soon finished her bottle, and after a little pat on the back and a not-so-ladylike burp, she began to fall asleep again. As carefully as I could, I placed the bottle in the kitchen sink, turned off the light, and slowly walked back to the bedroom. Placing Britney in the bassinet next to my bed, I watched her as she calmed down and drifted back into innocent baby sleep, blissfully unaware of my inner turmoil. My daughter was a reminder of the woman who reduced me to a shell of a man, afraid to go outside if it wasn't necessary. I found it difficult to talk to strangers and would always look over my shoulder at the slightest suspicion of unfamiliar movement. Britney's mother did this to me. But now, as a single father with a baby to care for and bills to pay, I was forced to fight these feelings every minute of every day. The feeling of humiliation, worthlessness, real pain that I felt almost daily in my limbs where I was tied. A single, unbidden tear rolled down my cheek as I watched Britney. Despite some of my features, she still closely resembled the woman who gave birth to her. My tormentor, my rapist. A little over 12 months ago, Britney's mother, Sheila, did something so terrible that she ended up in prison, causing me to withdraw into myself and withdraw from the world. I was now a single father and Sheila was not a part of our lives. In fact, she was no longer alive, having died within hours of giving birth due to complications, leaving me in the care of her daughter. When I lay down again, I pulled the sheet over me, turned on my side, and stared at the cradle. I could hear Britney's breathing getting deeper, and every now and then she would take a small shaky breath, as if to let me know that she was actually sleeping and not just lying there awake. I noticed this already in the first week. As I lay there, I reflected on how my feelings toward my daughter's mother were complicated, but definitely not positive. I wasn't in love with Sheila, and she knew it. From the very beginning, Sheila knew that I did not love her, and this was one of the small reasons why we ended up on this path in life that I was now on. I didn't even know Britney was a result of that night until social services showed up on my doorstep early Saturday morning with my infant daughter in tow. They knew very little about what happened, only that Sheila had died and that they were able to find me, naming me as her father. The two ladies who came to see me were shocked to learn that I did not know that Sheila was pregnant, let alone that she had given birth. They were shocked again when I showed them my scars, explaining that I couldn't know because of the restraining orders and the 2-week therapy sessions I was still attending. But somehow, I became a father, and from the very beginning, it was obvious that I was her father. I called my mother, and she was at my door within an hour, talking to social services and assuring me that everything would be okay, while I just sat there and stared blankly at whoever was holding Britney at that moment. I tried to say no several times, but between my mother being upset that I didn't want to raise her granddaughter and those two women telling me that the child care and foster care system just weren't equipped to handle care for a newborn when a biological parent is available, I was literally told to stand up and be on top. When I tried to explain to them that I was not capable of being a father, my mother snorted and said that no parent is ever ready. But whether I was ready or not, right or wrong, I was her biological father, her only surviving parent, and I realized I couldn't say no. My parents, especially my mother, helped me as much as they could. I was taught how to change diapers, how to swaddle a newborn, how to support the baby's neck, and how to carry him. I was given advice on what different cries mean, when they should sleep, when they shouldn't, and lots of other information, including medical care, support phone numbers, and the like that first-time parents learn throughout pregnancy. I had a 3-day crash course before Mom left me alone with Britney for the first time. Of course, within an hour I was overwhelmed, and the first night I panicked with every move. Every sound made me doubt myself. I felt resentful that I was now responsible for someone else when I could barely take care of myself. I sighed, bringing myself back to the present moment. It was a little after 3 in the morning, and not for the first time, I silently cursed Sheila. I was sure that even in death, she probably laughed about it. Our daughter, her final act of cruelty in a relationship I never really wanted, but which led to this sleeping baby lying next to me now. When I finally started to fall asleep, I was still wondering how everything could have gone so horribly wrong. My dreams took me back to that night, to the months that preceded it, to our first meeting, and to the night Sheila stole my innocence and imprisoned me in this nightmare. Before I became the recluse I am now, if you met me on the street or walking through the mall, chances are you wouldn't even notice me. My unkempt hair and almost pale skin, with remnants of acne that persisted even into my early 20s, made me just one of the crowd. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't ugly. In my opinion, I just wasn't someone who stood out. I would describe myself as a guy with average features, shock brown hair, and hazel eyes. I had an average build, wiry, but I had some muscle, thanks to the couple of hours a week I spent in the gym at work. Perhaps work was the most interesting thing about me. I was a nerd in school, passionate about computers and online games. I also did a little programming in my spare time at home. This interest led me to work in the Queensland Police Information Technology Department. I got the job when my uncle, a senior constable with the Queensland Police, helped me get an internship in high school. This progressed to part-time work and then full-time work in a junior position within the department. 6 months after I started working full-time, I also started studying for a bachelor's degree in technology part-time. It took me almost 5 years at the rate at which I completed the modules, but I believed that by the time I completed my degree, I would be a senior member of the technology team, and perhaps the prospect of a leadership position would open up for me. I also considered myself more frugal than the average person because while most of my peers were spending their time partying, drinking, and making casual acquaintances, I was saving most of my salary. 6 months after starting work, I was still commuting almost an hour by train. It was an easy journey, but quite far from the city. But then my parents noticed that there was a townhouse for sale on the outskirts of town. It was little more than a couple of bedrooms and a small kitchen and living room. But it was close to the city and the office, so it was good for a guy like me. With the help of a significant loan from my parents for the down payment and a deal with the bank for the next 30 years, I became a homeowner. Overall, like I said, you wouldn't pick me out of the crowd. I had a few friends that I hung out with, but they were more attractive, hung out more, laughed more, and the pressure of working full-time and paying off the mortgage wasn't there yet a real prospect for them. So even though I was going out, I was conservative with my spending, knowing that I had another loan payment coming up. It was with one of these groups of people that I first met Sheila. I was at a party with friends. We were on one of those Saturday pub quiz nights, everyone enjoying drinks while we feverishly wrote down answers to classic questions like, which river is the longest in New South Wales, Australia, and how long is the Great Barrier Reef? Everyone took a break from the questions until our host announced the correct answers, so a few people headed to the bar to refresh their drinks. I had just picked up the pint and turned around when she collided with me, spilling some of my new drink all over me. "Oh God, I'm so sorry," she said. "It's my fault. I'm really sorry." I shook the beer off my shirt and smiled at her, noticing that she was quite attractive. "It's okay. It's not the first time, and it probably won't be the last." I replied to the nervous-looking woman. We both laughed, and I went back to the table with my friends. I don't know how it happened, but by the end of the evening our group and her group were sitting together, talking as if they had known each other for years. Their team won the night, and they enjoyed their quiz, while our fifth-place group just enjoyed a drink. Somehow it happened that Sheila, as she introduced herself, sat next to me since our groups came together. She apologized again for what happened, and I waved her off again before we continued listening to my friend Tony talk about how he was caught running naked out of his girlfriend's house while her dad chased him with a bat in one hand and his underwear in the other. He told how he returned the next day and was reprimanded by her father and then her mother before getting down on one knee and proposing to the girl in front of them. We all burst out laughing listening to his story. It must be said that his bride, who was sitting next to him, was blushing, but proudly showed off a small stone on her ring finger. I admit, at that moment, I thought it was a good evening. Looking back, I sometimes wondered if I had actually tried to pull away from her in that moment, would our lives have turned out differently? Throughout the evening, Sheila and I chatted about innocent topics, as strangers do. We discussed what we were doing, people we might know, the weather for the coming week, and so on. It must also be admitted that Sheila was indeed an attractive woman. I would never have believed then what lay beneath that surface, but it was pleasing to the eye. She had sandy blonde hair that went down to the middle of her back. And for a woman in her early 20s, she had an attractive figure with nice curves, breasts that attracted attention, and a face that, while not supermodel-like, was not unattractive. Sheila had a bubbly personality, always smiling and laughing at any conversation at the table, but at the same time she had a certain nervousness that I couldn't put my finger on. She seemed desperate for attention, coupled with a fear of rejection, but when she looked at me, it seemed that this fear increased tenfold. That first evening, she was constantly next to me, touching my arm or shoulder. Several of my friends were looking at me, and by the end of the evening, Sheila and I had agreed on a future date. The smile she gave me when we decided on a time and place could have lit up the entire room when, with slight hesitation, I gave her my phone number. At that time, I didn't go beyond the second stage with the girls. As I mentioned earlier, I wasn't the most attractive guy, but I wasn't the ugliest either. I had a few girlfriends in high school, and a little affection was not uncommon. However, as sentimental as it was, I held on to my virginity until I found a woman who would truly appreciate this gift, because I felt that once I found her, our love would last forever. Sheila and I texted several times throughout the week, added each other on Instagram, and shared videos. If you've never seen Reels, they are short videos that Instagram users create and share on the platform. The following weekend, Sheila and I spent a pleasant afternoon wandering around the local art gallery, then had a late afternoon lunch before returning to the same pub with a combined group of friends. We drank again, talked about Instagram videos, and laughed until late into the night. Tipsy at the end of the evening, I noticed Sheila hinting at visiting her, but backing down when I told her that if she persisted, there would be no more dates. Instead, she agreed to a short kiss with the promise of more dates in the future if she behaved. Over the next 2 months, we continued to meet every Friday and Saturday. Yes, she was attractive and persistent in seeking more than just strokes. I once put my hand in her bra, and she managed to put her hand in my pants, but I just didn't feel that connection, that fire that would say that we are a couple for life. In the end, I broke up with her. She cried and told me how much she loved me, that I was her soulmate. But after just over 2 months of dating, I knew we weren't meant for each other, and I knew I had to be the bad guy and end the relationship. I thought that this would all end, and over time she would understand that we had no future. For several weeks after our breakup, she still called and texted, but I ignored her. I felt like a bit of an asshole, but I knew that if I continued to be friends with her, it would only make the problem worse. It had been 4 weeks since we broke up, the messages had all but stopped, and I thought it was all over until Sheila met me outside Queensland Police Headquarters one day after work. "Tommy, why are you ignoring me?" she asked pleadingly from the sidewalk as I walked down the steps. I sighed. It was becoming too much of a headache. "Sheila, I told her quickly before she started talking again. I already told you that I won't date you. Seriously, all these messages and letters need to stop. I'm sorry, but if it's any consolation, blame it on me, but outside of our mutual friends, you need to leave me alone. Sorry, Tommy, I can't do this. I love you, she declared loudly and emotionally, making the situation worse. I shook my head. She just didn't take the hint, and to be honest, there was something uneasy in her eyes. No, you don't, Sheila, I replied. We had only been dating for a couple of months. I explained to you why we broke up. The look she gave me said that she thought I was a fool for disagreeing with her. I sighed, quickly growing tired of her intrusiveness, but before I could say anything, Sheila spoke again. Tommy, you told me you didn't feel that spark. She sounded remorseful. But I can help you feel it, darling. I can make us connect if you come back to me. For the next few minutes, she spoke so eloquently about how wonderful it would be for us to be together, about the life we could share. I was just standing there waiting for it to be over when the two police officers I was working with walked out of the building and saw that I looked excited while Sheila continued to talk to me. Is there something wrong here, Tommy? Asked Senior Constable Douglas. No, it's okay, Marty, I replied. Just talking to my ex before I go home. Sheila and I have finished our conversation and will now go our separate ways. Finally, with a couple of police officers standing and watching us, she got the hint, and, after a few stern looks from Marty and his partner, Sheila and I went our separate ways, thankfully in opposite directions. I never heard from Sheila again. The next time I saw her was at dinner one Saturday night. I was again enjoying a meal with friends, sitting in a small open bistro, when she walked in with two friends. She saw me, hesitated when I noticed her, and waved at her, but did not come to me, which I took as progress. I smiled tightly, nodded, and thought that was all. A little later, when I had finished my medium rare steak with bacon stuffing and deep-fried potatoes, the waiter brought new drinks to the table. With compliments from the lady over there, he said, pointing to Sheila. We politely accepted our drinks and toasted Sheila. She didn't try to come to me again, and I thought things were finally okay. A little later in the evening, I decided to bury the hatchet and give her a formal greeting. I apologized to my friends and walked over to Sheila and her friends, exchanging greetings. We talked for about 10 minutes, and Sheila's friends invited me to stay for another drink. I think they wanted to support Sheila, but she apologized. Sorry, Tommy, she said with a hint of sadness. Their hearts are in the right place, but I know you don't feel the same way about me. I was about to answer, and Sheila's friends looked a little offended when she raised her hand. No, it's okay. I was too pushy, she admitted, blushing slightly. I really care about you, but I know that for a true romantic relationship, it has to be mutual. I smiled and agreed, feeling that we had moved to a new level. Maybe we could be friends. I told them I needed to use the restroom, but promised to stop by to say goodbye on the way back. When I returned, the last round of drinks were on the table, and I settled for one last round of shots. Sheila handed me mine, smiling widely, and the four of us toasted, and the drink went down. We talked some more, but I started to feel strange. That's the last thing I remember until what I assumed was several hours later. When I regained consciousness, it felt as if the entire world was pulsating and floating simultaneously through stormy waters and right in the center of my brain. To my surprise, I was also quite horny, which is not what I expected from an epic hangover. I felt the thin blanket over me, but was alarmed when I tried to move and realized I couldn't. My arms and legs were tied to the large bed on which I was lying. Having tested each limb, I found that they were secured, as was the torso. I could turn my head a little, but that was all. Despite the pain in my head, I began to panic and feel a growing sense of horror. There was a laugh from the side. It's good that you woke up, Sheila said. She was sitting naked on a chair. Sheila, I said with a hint of panic in my voice. What did you do to me? What are you going to do? She laughed again and walked over to me, running the back of her hand gently over my torso. It's okay, Tommy, my love. You'll be just fine. my crazy ex-girlfriend said. I love you and I know that after this night you will love me too. I'm sorry, but I put something in your drink to bring you here, but I need to tie you to me. You don't understand it yet, but we should be together. I didn't like the manic look in her eyes. Sheila removed the sheet from me. She smiled at me, and despite my attempts to resist, she climbed on top of me. Almost 2 hours later, she was using me. She didn't even notice that I turned green with nausea several times, throwing up twice in the process. My chest was burning, my limbs were numb, I was in terrible pain. Seeing my anxiety, Sheila leaned over to inspect me closely. Now I realized that she was also on something, as her eyes were slightly blurred. In subsequent therapy, I realized that by that time I was partially disconnected from reality. I let her kiss me since I was practically catatonic from the trauma by that point. Behind my eyes, it was as if there was a dark room. I was alone, pressed to the corner, and every sound, every movement caused me only the anticipation of pain. I heard her tell me over and over that she loved me, that everything would be okay because we were connected now. She said she would take care of me. Luckily, I passed out from exhaustion when Sheila started humming to herself. I woke up, I think, the next morning with the remainder of the substance almost completely out of my system, and I had a hellish headache, worse than before, when Sheila took my virginity. But I noticed that the bonds were cut. Looking around the room, I didn't see or hear Sheila, so I took the chance that it was safe to stand up. Getting up was so painful that I winced when I got out of bed. Weak and naked, I grabbed a towel lying on the chair next to the bedroom door and staggered to her front door. Barely able to stand, I walked out of Sheila's apartment and into the morning sun. I winced again, this time from the bright sunlight that hurt my eyes. Without thinking, I raised my hand to protect my sore eyes. I felt myself being rocked back and forth. When I lowered my hand to look where I was going, there was a mother with 3 children in front of me. All 4 of them looked at me. I especially noticed the worried expression on my mother's face. I must have been a terrible sight for her, wearing only a towel and with obvious bleeding wounds. "Hello," I said before falling to the ground, unable to stand any longer. Over the next 15 minutes, an ambulance and 2 police cars arrived. The family that found me brought a blanket, and even under it, I quickly began shaking and crying like an abandoned child. While the medical team was working on me, I heard them talk about serious injury and loss of blood several times. The next day, I learned that the police had declared Sheila's apartment a crime scene, and Sheila herself had been arrested when she happily returned home with food and medical supplies to, as she believed, take care of me, unaware that she was expected. The police found my clothes, phone, and wallet on a shelf in her spare bedroom. Sheila apparently told the authorities that she planned to treat me and take care of me since we were now bonded forever. She was surprised when, less than a week later, she was charged with aggravated assault, causing great bodily harm and deprivation of liberty. I spent almost a week in the hospital, and after that my parents arranged for me to stay at a rehab center. They enrolled me in a program designed for victims of violence. I was one of 3 men in the program. Yes, I learned that men can be victims too. The river flows in both directions. Luckily, having worked for the government and the police, they had excellent insurance and were happy to cover the cost of my treatment. In the first month, as far as I remember, there was not a night when I did not wake up screaming at least once, and sometimes this happened several times. But luckily, the center knew this was likely to happen, and there was always a nurse on duty and consultants there to help me. By the time I left the center, I was on a whole bunch of new medications, most of them anti-anxiety/antidepressants that were supposed to help me deal with the ongoing nightmares and self-loathing. My parents supported me, as did several of my colleagues who were informed of what happened to support the broken man I had become. Even before I returned to work, my boss spent a lot of time with me to make sure I felt safe as they smoothly brought me back into the work process. It was several months after that night before I returned to work. I did some data migration, did some documentation, nothing too strenuous. I tried to do nothing but drive to and from work. I even ordered groceries online so as not to go out into public places. I was able to buy a cheap car, and at work they allowed me to park in an underground parking lot, so I was almost never on the street where strangers might unexpectedly meet me. In terms of legal issues, Sheila went through lawsuits. I provided a victim impact statement for the prosecution and was told that evidence of the horror that occurred in her bedroom, coupled with a test of my blood and photographs of my wounds, caused more than one member of the jury to vomit as prosecutors successfully did their job. I was granted a formal restraining order and Sheila was prohibited from approaching me, although this would not have been a problem as I was informed that she had been given over 20 years imprisonment on all charges. Sheila will be released when she is well past her prime. I would like to say that I wished for her help and recovery, but that would be a lie. The thoughts I harbored about her were dark. Many of them I couldn't write down because just thinking about what I wanted to do made me disgusted with myself. The first therapist I went to had a good understanding of what I was struggling with and tried to get it out of me, pushing me every session, telling me it was better to let out my dark thoughts because anger and hatred are common among victims, and these poisons must be fought if I want to move forward. In response to his attempts to draw dark thoughts out of me, I attempted to overdose on my medications. Luckily, the drugs weren't that strong. I spent the night in hospital before being discharged to stay with my parents for the next month, with extra time off from work. A new psychologist was needed who would work with me and not try to force me to relive the trauma as the first one did. The second time, I didn't even realize what I was doing. This was about 8 months after that terrible night, and I thought I was getting better. But then someone at work mentioned that Sheila tried to commit suicide in her cell, but was unsuccessful. I didn't know what to think, so that evening I went home through the nearby liquor store and bought a bottle of Jack Daniels. The next thing I remember is waking up in the hospital with the most sour and upset stomach I've ever had. It turned out that when I didn't show up for work in the morning, my boss became worried and came to my house with several officers, where they found me on the kitchen floor, again in a puddle of my own vomit. After the night in the hospital, I spent another 2 weeks in rehab. I ended up buying my boss a huge bouquet of flowers from a very expensive florist as a thank you for saving my life. Now, almost a year later, I am still a shell of who I once was. But if there is someone next to me whom I know well, I can tolerate being in public. My parents are concerned, but they know what I've been through, and although they want me to get better, they understand that it will take a long time to get over what Sheila did to me. And then, one day, while I was watching a movie at home, Britney came into my life. Now we're back to me lying there trying to sleep, a single father, broken but knowing that I need to take care of Britney, even as I struggle inside between wanting to be with her and wanting her to never be born. As the months passed, Britney and I grew accustomed to each other, and I felt my heart begin to warm to her. Despite the painful feelings, I began to look forward to the moment when I could hold her in my arms when returning home after work. My mother, being a loving grandmother, took care of her when I had to go to work, and in those first months, I don't know if Britney and I would have survived without her help. "It's okay, Tommy," she encouraged me. "No first-time parent does everything right. You're doing great. Britney is a very healthy and happy baby." I love my mom, and of course, she took a lot of photos of Britney and worked tirelessly to get me to pose with her in many of them. She probably understood even more than I that I was gradually growing to love my daughter, but she was still worried about the underlying resentment I harbored towards her mother, now deceased. By the time Britney was 3 years old, I had fully accepted her as my daughter, and we became like a team against the world. Not surprisingly, Britney was the key to my recovery, and at almost 25 years old, I was one of the youngest fathers in her daycare. But now I couldn't imagine life without my daughter. Even at such a young age, Britney understood that I was a little different from other dads, but this only made her more protective of me. Hugs and kisses were her way of expressing her love, showing how much she loved me, and I never refused these expressions of affection. 3 times a week, I dropped Britney off at the local daycare on my way to work, and the other 2 days I worked from home, completing reports and paperwork while caring for her. Mom and Dad were often there to look after their granddaughter, but because of our circumstances, she truly became Daddy's little girl. When she was almost 3.5 years old, my daughter was already walking, talking, and even helping me a little around the house. I was able to go out in public with her and even tolerated trips to the supermarket or mall for short periods of time if she was nearby. I found it exhausting, but Britney always thanked me for these trips with lots of kisses and hugs afterwards. One afternoon, after work, I went to pick her up from kindergarten. Britney ran towards me, beaming with joy, waving the piece of paper as if it were the most important letter in the world. "Daddy," she exclaimed in her sweet little voice, waving the invitation. "Denny's inviting me to his birthday party. Should we go?" I smiled at my daughter and got down on one knee so I could be at her level and have a better view of her eyes. "How about we call Denny's mom and talk to her?" I suggested. She responded by giving me one of her warm hugs. Strangely, now that Britney was becoming more like her mother, I no longer saw her as a reminder of Sheila. She still had my eyes, and I could already imagine how one day she would become a real beauty with long blonde hair and a stubborn character. That evening, I called Mary, Denny's mom. Although his dad worked with me, I knew it was moms who organized these events, and with Britney by my side, I confirmed our participation at the Play Center party 2 Saturdays later. That Saturday morning, my daughter was so excited that it felt like she had eaten 3 bowls of pure sugar for breakfast. Birthday parties and play centers are one of children's favorite pastimes. Britney was quite popular in her kindergarten class, so I knew she loved to play with her classmates, and this was her first time at the play center. Nervously, I walked into the play center with my daughter. Not only was it her first time attending a birthday party, but it was also my first time being with her in a public place where I wouldn't be able to see her all the time. Holding hands, we checked in and I saw Mary. We greeted each other and smiled as Denny, Britney, and several other children disappeared into the maze of brightly colored pipes and slides. A few minutes later, I practiced breathing techniques while smiling at the other parents, hoping they wouldn't notice my tension. After taking a deep breath and exhaling, telling myself that I was being stupid, I began to think about the French fries and cola when I suddenly felt someone's presence next to me. Turning around, I expected to see one of the parents or relatives of the children playing on the playground. Standing in front of me was an attractive blonde with a pleasant face, graceful curves, and a slight smile. I started to return her smile when my brain suddenly realized what I was seeing and my face froze. Suddenly, I felt my pulse pounding in my ears, roaring like wild water on a flooded river rushing through the rapids. I couldn't help myself, I screamed. This piercing scream stopped all sounds in the center. How could Sheila end up here? "No!" I shouted. "No! Stay away! Get away from me!" The woman looked at me with horror on her face, but I was already backing away, trying to retreat as quickly as possible. Everyone around me seemed to be looking at me now as I tripped over a child's chair and table, breaking it in my attempt to get away from her. Without thinking, I grabbed the remains of the plastic baby chair, holding it in front of me like a lion tamer before a beast that was ready to attack him. Tears rolled down my face, and I whimpered in fear as the woman stood there, not moving since I started screaming. I felt myself begin to choke when my daughter suddenly burst onto the stage in front of me, arms outstretched and a serious expression on her face, looking at a woman she had never seen. "Stay away from my dad," she shouted. Sheila was still standing there, horrified by the way Britney and I had reacted to her appearance and not making a move in our direction, while the employees of the center, young guys earning money on the weekend, approached us cautiously, as if we were lions, not the woman who ruined my life right in front of me. They need to understand that I'm only defending Britney and myself. I'm not going to attack them. Suddenly realizing that no one is doing anything to make the situation worse, Britney turns to me and throws herself into my arms. "Dad, what's wrong with you, Dad?" she cries, not realizing that her mother is standing only 5 steps away from her. Without saying a word and letting my body act automatically, I lifted my daughter into my arms and headed for the exit. Britney sobbed while everyone around her watched us run away. Mary stood there with a stunned expression on her face, as did almost everyone else. But as I walked through the exit, I noticed that Sheila had not moved from her place. Her face was still a mask of surprise and horror at my reaction. Okay, I won't let her take my daughter. We got to my car. I have an old Toyota Camry station wagon, and I opened the door and put Britney in her seat. But then a sudden feeling of helplessness came over me, and I collapsed on the ground, sobbing, before I could strap it on. I must have laid there for about 5 minutes before I felt Britney put her arm around me, leaning toward the car, her hand running through my hair tenderly. "It's okay, Dad, it's okay, Dad," she kept repeating. I don't know how much time passed before I felt another hand on my back. I turned around, expecting to see Sheila, ready to push her away so she couldn't catch me again. But it was Brad, Mary's husband and Denny's father. "Tommy, are you okay?" he asked with obvious concern on his face. He and Mary knew a little about my history, so they were at least somewhat understanding. "My dad is strong," Britney said before I could answer. "It's just the two of us, and this woman won't do anything to hurt him," my daughter said confidently, making me smile despite the situation. A small crowd had gathered outside, and I noticed Sheila standing behind me with a worried look on her face. For a moment my panic returned until I finally realized that this woman was not Sheila. This poor woman I screamed at in panic did bear some resemblance to Sheila, but she was not the one who ruined my life. I couldn't help but look at her again as I began to apply my breathing techniques. Feeling my heart rate slow, I lifted Britney out of the car and hugged her tightly, turning to the crowd of concerned people and assuring them that I was fine. I spent the next few minutes blushing profusely, apologizing for my outburst. Brad and Mary also talked to those around them and, with my permission, asked if Britney and I could go back inside. After a few anxious questions and accompanied by the center manager, who was very friendly and offered to buy me some food, we headed back inside. When I tried to pay for the food and the damaged furniture, he refused. I explained that I had experienced a very severe trauma several years ago, and it suddenly flared up when several different factors came together at once. More than one person looked at the woman, then at me and back again, but I told them it wasn't her fault. We had never met, although I still received puzzled looks from others. Half an hour later, I was sitting at the table with potatoes and a Coke when a woman came and sat next to me. Barely audible, she softly asked, "Are you really okay?" I closed my eyes for a moment and swallowed, then again, fighting the memory as even her voice sounded like Sheila's. Her voice was a little deeper than Britney's mother's, but still very similar. Although my logical brain understood that this was not my offender because Sheila died more than 3 years ago. But still I struggled with emotions. Although there were some similarities in appearance, this woman still looked different up close. Sighing, trying to calm my emotions, I opened my eyes again and tried to smile at her warmly. "Yes," I answered quietly. "I'm sorry I reacted to you that way. It's just that you reminded me of someone I knew years ago, and unfortunately for me, it wasn't a pleasant experience." At that moment, Britney ran up, hugged me, and kissed me, asking if I was okay before giving the woman another careful look. I told her I was fine, and after another moment, my daughter ran off to play again. She's been doing this every few minutes since we got back. It brought smiles to all of us. "She's very nice," said the woman, not Sheila. "Probably her mother." I shook my head. "She died in childbirth," I said. The woman nodded as if she already knew. Although I found it difficult to look at her for more than a few seconds, I sensed her hesitation, as if she was struggling with some issue. After a few moments, as if afraid to ask, she simply blurted it out, still in a quiet voice. "Are you the same person Sheila hurt?" It took me a few seconds to realize that the woman was talking about Britney's mother and my abuser. Realizing that my panic had begun to rise again, she raised both hands, sensing that my emotions were moving in the wrong direction. "It's okay, I'm not a threat," she told me in as non-threatening a tone as possible. "I will not harm you or your daughter." I nodded, not completely convinced. Breathe, Tommy, I told myself. Just breathe. My name is Sarah, she added after a moment, holding out her hand, but when she saw my gaze, she pulled it back and tried to smile at me without hostility. I swallowed and found the strength to extend my trembling hand to her, which she lightly touched. Tommy, I said carefully. It took a while, mostly me fighting the impulse to grab my daughter and run, being patient with Sarah, and a few concerned adults like Mary and Brad checking on me, but we talked, and it turned out that Sarah was Sheila's cousin. Their mothers are sisters. She brought the child to the party as a favor for a friend whose parents couldn't make it that day. Sarah admitted that she knew only a little about what happened between Sheila and me. The family was quite private when it came to Sheila. Other than her parents, no one was willing to confirm that she was pregnant, let alone that she had given birth. For most, these were just rumors. The only thing the family knew for sure was that she did something terrible to a guy and died in prison because of it. Sarah explained while watching Britney play that there had been rumors about a baby, but nothing had been confirmed. Her aunt and uncle, Sheila's parents, apparently thought the baby died with Sheila or was given up for adoption. But it's her, isn't it? Sarah asked me as we continued to watch Britney play with her two friends from kindergarten. They were running down the slide, and I noticed that Britney stayed close to the edge, close to me, and didn't go too far into the playground if it meant she couldn't see me for more than a few seconds. This is Sheila's daughter, and you are her father, aren't you? It was more of a statement than a question, and I nodded slowly. Yes, I said softly, looking back at my precious daughter. At that moment, Britney looked at me, and I waved at her, and she smiled and waved back. It was. Sorry, it's hard. Britney is everything to me. She's the only good thing that came out of that terrible time. Most days I don't see her. I just see Britney. I couldn't find the words and decided to look at Sarah, who nodded sadly. Like I said, Tommy, Sarah explained quietly, I don't know much about what happened, but from what I heard and your reaction earlier when you thought I was Sheila, I understand that it was something terrible. For the next hour, as we continued talking, I was cagey about everything. But I think Sarah could understand. She tried to be friendly, but honestly, other than Britney, I felt like I was distancing myself from the situation by putting up my own barriers. By the time we left, I was barely functioning. That night at home, Britney was very affectionate. Dad, are you okay? It's pronounced okay, honey, I replied with a forced smile. And yes, Dad is fine. You scared me, she said with tears in her eyes. Then she whispered, I thought you might die. Death was an interesting topic for the two of us. Ever since she learned to speak in full sentences about a year ago, she has had an interest in death. It started in her kindergarten where she realized she didn't have a mom, and I had to carefully explain that her mom had died. I'm not going anywhere, Britt, I told her as I tucked her into bed. I just got a little scared today. She looked at me for a minute with a very serious expression on her face. Did that lady offend you? She asked with concern. I shook my head, smiling. No, honey, I replied. She wasn't hurtful, and it wasn't her fault. She just looked like someone I once knew who hurt me badly. I hope I never meet her, Britney said, frowning. I would have hit her. I smiled sadly, although my daughter didn't understand why. How can I tell her that it was her own mother who hurt me so much that I reacted this way to someone I've never met? When I got into bed later, I tossed and turned for a few hours, then took a couple of sleeping pills, which I haven't needed since Britney came into my life. After this, I fell into a restless sleep. The following week at work, I was surprised when I was called to the head security guard and found Sarah there wanting to talk to me. Pushing down the feeling of panic in the back of my mind, I called my manager and informed her that I would be gone for a while, possibly a few hours. Sarah and I went to a cafe on the next block that overlooked the construction of a new transportation center for the city. We ordered coffee, Sarah had a caramel latte, and I had my usual cappuccino with oat milk. There was an awkward silence when we sat down. After a few sips of coffee, I finally ventured, How can I help you, Sarah? I deliberately said her name, more to convince myself that she was not Sheila than for anything else. She looked at me for another minute, noticing my slightly worried look and the way my eyes flickered, noticing my slightly worried look and my eyes darting around the room. She swallowed. "I'm sorry, Tommy," she explained. "Mostly I wanted to know how you were doing. I mean, I've never been so scared in my life that the mere sight of me would cause such a reaction in another person. I didn't sleep at all during this time, and as bad as it was for me, it must have been orders of magnitude worse for you." I nodded and swallowed again, and then, a few moments later, again. "It's okay," I finally told her. "Doesn't mean you can help if you're like her, Sheila." I looked at Sarah for a minute, and she tried not to be too obvious as she looked back at me. "Could you treat me to something for a few minutes?" I asked her. She gave me a tight smile and nodded, but I could also see the worry in her eyes. I took a deep breath and focused my attention on the woman in front of me for the first time. Sarah was an attractive woman in her own right. Her hair was lighter than Sheila's, her eyes were brown instead of blue, but her posture was exactly the same. Her hands were graceful, with many freckles, and her lips were perhaps less prominent than Sheila's. There was no doubt about their relationship. But upon closer examination, there was also no doubt that these were very different women. After a minute of my silence, Sarah began to feel uneasy, but I raised my hand and gave her the first warm smile that had nothing to do with my past trauma involving her cousin. "Sorry, I know it was awkward," I explained. "That's what one of my counselors taught me, if I ever meet someone like her. I mean, like Sheila. I just needed to look at you and tell my mind again that you are not her, to show myself the differences between the two of you, to see you as a different person." Sarah nodded, again hesitant to ask the question I knew she wanted to ask. I waited and smiled as she took a very deep breath. I knew this would happen. "Tommy, what really happened?" she asked. "I mean, we knew that Sheila was with a guy, that something bad had happened. Now I know that someone was you. I'm guessing you were together for a while, but she did something terrible that landed her in jail, where she died. But what really happened? None of the family members who know anything will say anything, and the rest whisper about the rumors. I mean, something bad happened, but can you talk about it?" I looked at her for another minute. For the last couple of years, I've only talked about what happened with my parents and my therapist. Anyone who asked, I immediately ignored until they stopped asking questions. Was I going to do this to her cousin, a woman who seemed more concerned about me and what happened over the weekend than just being curious? Time to be brave. I undid the buttons on the cuffs and rolled up my sleeves, revealing the scars on my wrists. Sarah gasped when she saw the wrinkled skin. Sheila drugged me with something, tied me up, and struggled with me for several hours against my will. These scars and scars on my ankles are a reminder that I tried to stand up to her for trying to say no. When I explained what had happened, Sarah turned pale, her eyes growing wider and wider in shock. Rolling up my sleeves, I explained in some detail how we met, spent a couple of months in a relationship, our breakup, an ill-fated evening meeting, and what happened next. Surprisingly, I never shed a tear during the retelling, but Sarah cried and had to get out some tissues during my story. "Sheila, I didn't take no for an answer, and I paid for it," I sighed when I finished. "But," I told Sarah and paused, smiling for the first time in my story, "through pain I got Britney." I thought about how to explain my forced parenthood, unexpected and unwanted, and how Britney became my reason for living. I couldn't stand it for the first month, I told her. She was a product of the evil that was done to me, but then everything changed. "What? What happened?" Sarah asked in an uncertain voice, still holding the tear-stained napkin in one hand. "Well, it was one evening. I don't know what day it was. They were all leaking at the time, and I was changing a wet diaper. I slowly got used to the process of lifting, taking off, cleaning, and changing. But for some reason, Britney cried when I took her diaper off, so without thinking, I grabbed her bare ass." Sarah smiled. I was doing what all dads do with her over their shoulder when she suddenly stopped crying and then let loose. We both wrinkled our noses. Worse for me than Sarah, I could still smell the memories. "What did you do?" Sarah asked eagerly, wanting to know the end of the story. I shrugged. "I kind of lost it," I admitted. "Oh, I protected Britney. I may have been a broken man and full of regret for what was done to me, but Britney relied on me her whole life, and I would be a fool if I did anything to hurt her." So, covered in her waist, I sank to the floor and sat, hugging her and sobbing at what my life had become. But while I was sitting there, Britney touched my cheek and giggled. It was the first time, when I was just a few months old, that she touched my cheek. I smiled at the memory. My daughter's eyes went wide as she could barely turn her head to look at me. A week ago, I would have had to support her neck and head. It was a turning point for me, I continued to explain. For the first time since everything started happening, I laughed and Britney joined in with that baby squeal they do, which made me angry again. We went from sadness to joy and spent the next 5 minutes laughing at each other. Here we were, father and daughter, tired in the dead of night, laughing as if nothing else mattered. Sarah was smiling now, seeing the happiness reflected in my eyes as I recalled this memory. "So, that was the moment I decided I was going to get out of this mess I was in." Sarah laughed at my statement. "I took us both to the shower, washed the mess down the drain, and cleaned up before putting Britney to bed. I kissed her before I put her to bed, and that was the first night I told my daughter I loved her. I mean myself love her," I said to the woman across from me, as if she couldn't believe that I wouldn't love my own flesh and blood. It seemed unreal to me at that moment. I must have watched her sleep for over 2 hours that night, and she never woke up. But on a night full of firsts, I was amazed that something so beautiful could come out of something so terrible. "That's good to hear, Tommy," Sarah said, with a new tearful glint in her eyes, trying to distract herself by taking another sip of her coffee. I nodded, smiling again. We spent another hour talking, and I was surprised to find that she was a good listener. Sarah thought about her words before saying anything. It turned out that Sarah worked in another government department a few blocks away. With a little cunning maneuvering on her part, she made only one request the opportunity to talk again. I hesitated for only a moment before I agreed. She said it was as much so that I could find some closure as it was so that she could feel better about the reaction she had caused. Over the next month, we met for lunch several times. Each time, Sarah met me at the security post and walked with me. She never mentioned that every time I had to sit with my back to the wall and keep a close eye on whoever came through the door. I learned more about her. She worked as a junior city planner in the Department of Infrastructure, helping to review and define various zones in cities in our state. I told her about my job in the IT department, and we became more and more comfortable with each other. Sarah even spent a few evenings with Britney and me. After the initial awkwardness, Sarah asked if she could braid Britney's hair, and from that point on, any remaining issues my daughter had with Sarah disappeared, and they became fast friends. As I watched them, I kept noticing, and then remembering how different Sarah was compared to Sheila. The way she sat and paid attention to things, the way she constantly touched the back of her head when she was nervous. Sheila would have laughed in an uncomfortable situation. Sarah became quieter and more reserved. A few months later, we had developed a routine that I felt comfortable with, and I finally began to realize that I didn't have to worry about Sarah hurting me or Britney. One day, we were sitting in a cafe between our workstations having lunch, and she was telling me a story about how they had to move the bus stop 300 meters away from a proposed shopping center because two frognets decided they liked to mate loudly in the middle of the day right there, where the bus stop was supposed to be, when she suddenly stopped and looked at me strangely. "What?" I asked, suddenly feeling unsure. "Is there something on my face?" "No, it's just that since we met, I've never seen you really smile, I mean, except when you talked about Britney. But right now you did." "That's not true. I smile all the time," I replied, somewhat warily. Sarah looked away. "Not with me." I sat back in my chair, contemplating her words. It was true, although I was starting to see Sarah as a friend, somewhere deep down, I still felt bad about the way we met. Sorry, I told her. I'm still struggling, I guess. Sarah nodded and looked at me again, seeing the lost expression on my face. Tommy, it's okay. I know you continue to fight your demons. In fact, that's part of why I want to spend time with you. Because of my demons? I asked, raising an eyebrow. She nodded again. My cousin did something unforgivable, she said. She paid the ultimate price, giving her life in penance. But it still leaves you, and to some extent Britney, with scars. I snorted. Britney is fine, I'm the one who's broken. This time Sarah smiled and then shook her head. I'm sorry, Tommy, but you're wrong, more wrong than you can imagine, Sarah said. This was the first time she spoke to me so forcefully. I waited. My natural first reaction was to get up and leave, to run away. But I resisted. Sarah noticed my movement and smiled. See, she said, right now, at this moment. Tommy, you are an incredible person. After what happened to you, you could spend your whole life hiding, running away from every feeling, and no one would blame you. But you don't. You fight it every time, and every day you get better at it. You choose to live despite what many have done to you. I wanted to answer, but she raised her hand again with a smile. Yes, yes, I know. You are broken, damaged, an empty shell of a person. I understand, she said. I know you'll never completely get rid of your demons. I've read a little about how to support people in your situation. I looked at her in surprise, and she continued to smile. I care, Tommy, Sarah explained, sadness returning to her face. Perhaps it's the guilt of how we met, that you momentarily mistook me for your cousin. Perhaps it's that I see a broken person that I want to help, because there was once one between us. A person we haven't noticed. But Tommy, I really care about you and Britney. We were silent for some time. I understand you, Sarah, I finally answered, looking down into my cup of coffee, not wanting to meet her eyes. And I would be lying if I said that it didn't mean anything to me. But how does Britney relate to this? She never knew her mother. For her, it was always just me. Tommy, you're a wonderful father, and I see that Britney has been your anchor. But she's getting older. Surely she notices that other kids have two parents. I shrugged. Of course, but she also knows that her mother died. But she doesn't know how, Sarah explained. She'll have questions in the next few years. Of course, the scars on the surface reflect the scars you carry inside. But Britney doesn't even know that she inherited a legacy of scars from her mother. One day, you'll have to tell her something about what Sheila did. You may never be able to tell her the whole truth, but you can't lie, and you'll have to say something. Besides me, Britney has never met anyone from her mother's family, and she doesn't know that we are. She has relatives with her. On the other hand, my family doesn't even know about her existence. But sooner or later, you'll have to talk to her about it. You didn't say anything? I asked the woman opposite me about her family. No, Sarah said quietly, shaking her head. I didn't feel like it was my role, and was even hesitant to mention it. You already have enough on your shoulders to deal with. The other side of the family. Were you hesitant? Is there anything else? I asked. Sarah didn't say anything for a few seconds, and then nodded. I learned to distinguish between when she was silent and when she was struggling with something. It was a case of struggle. She was desperate to ask me a question or tell me something that probably concerned Sheila. She took a deep breath. Next month, she began, there will be a family meeting. I would like your permission to tell Sheila's parents that they have a granddaughter who is alive and well. But I know that this will cause conversations that may lead to you having to deal with people who can bring up memories you'd rather not remember. We were both silent for a little longer. I was lost in thought as Sarah waited patiently. I looked out the window of the cafe and noticed a tree planted in one of the gardens between the sidewalk and the road. Being one of our colder months, the tree was almost leafless, nothing more than a collection of branches and one or two very sad brown leaves refusing to fall. But I knew that as the weather warmed up and we moved out of winter, new shoots would appear on the tree. Small green buds will begin to bloom as the weather warms, and soon the tree will be covered in lush foliage. I let out one of the most expressive sighs in the history of sighs, deciding to do something that I knew would take me outside of my comfort zone like never before. What if? I said quietly, so quietly that Sarah had to lean a little closer to hear me. What if Britney and I come with you? Will they accept us? I asked. Sarah's eyes opened wide. I knew she wanted to smile, but she stopped herself. Do you think you can do this? I don't know, I shrugged. But Sarah, you're right. Britney has another part of the family that she needs to get to know. I have to let this happen. If you stick with us, maybe I can handle it. Without thinking, Sarah reached across the table and grabbed my right hand. Oh, Tommy, that would be wonderful. Then she realized what she had done and let go of my hand. Sorry. I smiled discreetly. It's okay, Sarah, it's okay, I said, and surprised myself by realizing that I really meant it. We met for lunch almost every day for the next few weeks. She also came to my house and spent time with Britney and me. A week before the event, with my permission, she told her parents about the existence of Britney and I, asking them to keep it a secret. But she allowed her mother to tell her sister about the existence of her granddaughter. On the morning of the family meeting, I was a nervous wreck. However, Sarah arrived a couple of hours early and helped me get Britney ready. Dad, are you okay? My daughter asked me as I tried to stop my hands from shaking. Her question forced me to fight my fears so as not to upset her. I nodded seriously, gritting my teeth with emotion. Your dad is just a little worried, Britney said, sitting down in a chair and then lifting her onto her lap. Britney had become more comfortable with Sarah over the past couple of months, and I knew Sarah would be important to us getting through this day. Sarah held out her hand to me. I hesitated, and then looked at Britney, who was looking at me, a look of concern on her almost 4-year-old face. I took Sarah's hand, and she immediately placed it on my daughter's while I squatted down to be level with her. Britney, we're going to meet a few people today. This is your mom's side of the family. Mom's family, she whispered, eyes wide. That's right, I said. This will be hard for me, but I know it's important for you to be able to meet your mom's family. Sarah here is your mom's cousin. Cousin? Britney asked. Like you and Braden, I said, referring to my older brother's son. Braden is nasty, he farts and thinks it's funny, Britney said, wincing. I smiled at Britney. Yes, but he's your cousin, he's family, I repeated. Sarah is your mom's cousin, and she invited us to meet your mom's family today. Are you going to be okay, Dad? I know my mom hasn't been good to you, Britney asked. I almost fell back in surprise. I thought Britney didn't know, but apparently kids are always a lot more perceptive than we give them credit for. I'll be fine, Princess, I replied, forcing a smile on my face. If you care about me. She jumped off Sarah's lap, put her arms around my neck, and kissed me. I will always take care of you, Daddy, she said as if it was undeniable. I know, beautiful girl, I know, I said, hugging her tightly. We arrived a little before noon. Sarah came with us in my car. She was a great travel companion, keeping Britney and I from thinking about the upcoming meeting. The drive took a little over half an hour, and while we were driving, she distracted us by playing Guess What I See with us. Sarah's parents' house was an old 2-story building, built almost 20 years ago. When we approached it, there were already a dozen cars parked on both sides of the street. But the driveway spot was free and Sarah told me to park there. That spot was reserved for us. I turned off the car and felt every muscle in my body tense. I could feel the pulse in my neck. My breathing quickened. Sarah put her hand on my shoulder. It's okay, Tommy. Just breathe and focus on my voice. You'll do fine, she told me. I closed my eyes and began to breathe. Sarah continued to speak to me softly, and I gradually relaxed. As we approached the house, I held Britney in my arms while Sarah walked a couple steps ahead of us. Walking inside, Sarah called out, Mom, Dad, Aunt Carrie, Uncle Don, we're here. She led us into the kitchen, where 4 elderly people were waiting. They looked almost as tense as I did. Sarah hugged each of them briefly as we watched, then turned and introduced us. Tommy, Britney, these are my parents, Gary and Wanda, and my aunt and uncle, Carrie and Don. Hello, everyone. This is Tommy and Britney. Carrie took a timid step forward, supported by Dawn. I saw the excitement in her eyes, eyes that were very reminiscent of Sheila's. She extended her hand. It's very nice to meet you, Tommy, Britney, she said. I hesitated for a moment and took her outstretched hand, shaking it briefly. She looked at Britney, then at me, and I nodded. Hi, Britney, Carrie said softly. Britney buried her face in my shoulder. Say hello, honey, I told her. Hi, she replied, looking at everyone through one narrowed eye, her head still pressed against my shoulder. Carrie and Dawn smiled. I noticed that Sheila had the same facial features as Dawn, the same structure of her cheekbones and mouth. I gulped. How old are you, Britney? Carrie asked. This question made Britney sit up and look at everyone. They smiled. She showed 3 fingers. 3, she said. I squeezed her, and she corrected herself. 3. You're so big for 3 years old, Carrie replied. It was the right move. Britney beamed. Are you my mother's parents? She suddenly asked, looking at them. They looked at me for a moment, and I nodded, and they smiled. Yes, baby, we're your mommy's parents, Don replied, placing his hand on Carrie's shoulder as Carrie gasped quietly. Britney looked around the room, then looked back at me. Are they like grandparents? She asked, referring to my parents. Yes, Britney, I replied, trying to remain calm. They're the same. After that, we spent a few more awkward moments getting to know each other, and Britney felt comfortable enough to move away from my arms. We have most of the family waiting in the yard for introductions, Gary told us. We thought we shouldn't overload you right away. I nodded and closed my eyes. Breathing deeply, I felt Britney suddenly hug my leg and a hand enter mine. Just breathe, Tommy, Sarah encouraged me, standing next to me, noticing that I was having a hard time. It's okay, Britney, and I will be with you the whole time. I opened my eyes, surprised that Sarah was holding my hand, and saw the worried faces of the other people in the room. Sarah, you could tell them everything. I don't know. It's already hard for me just to be here. I muttered quietly, still trying to hold back the tears, fighting the panic, the memories. She shook her head quietly, and I felt her squeeze my hand. It's okay, Tommy, I'll support you. How about we explain later? Talking about it now might open up wounds that you don't need to focus on right now. How about you just breathe and get to know people? Britney and I will be with you all the time, okay? I nodded slowly. As the grandparents watched, I leaned over and kissed my daughter, telling her that Daddy was okay. Then he suggested that she take her grandparents' hands, and we went to meet everyone. She nodded, and Carrie and Dawn smiled widely as they held their granddaughter's hands for the first time. We all walked out onto the back deck together. There were about 20 people gathered outside. I tried not to think of them as Sheila's family, but more as Britney's extended family. Over the next 20 minutes, Britney and I were slowly introduced. Sheila's name was said a dozen times, and each time I inhaled sharply. During the first hour, I never felt so weak and pathetic as I did then. I was the person that Sheila broke, afraid to talk to someone. Sarah had to intervene to keep me from grabbing Britney and running away. I realized that Carrie and Dawn, along with Gary and Wanda, knew enough to keep many family members from talking to me for too long. I was grateful to them for this. Finally, I sat down at the table with Sarah's parents, as well as Dawn and Carrie, and there was an empty seat at the table for Sarah. Gary brought me a plate of food. At least it made me smile. Smoked pork ribs coated in spicy barbecue sauce with mac and cheese and coleslaw. Coleslaw is a type of cabbage salad with crispy noodles and soy sauce. It was so delicious. Gary smiled and Wanda laughed as I moaned with pleasure as I tasted the ribs. This is our boy, Craig, Sarah's little brother, Wanda said, pointing to a guy a year or two younger than Sarah, wearing a flowered apron. He's very into barbecue and will smoke anything any chance he gets. After eating no more than a dozen bites, Sarah brought her plate and sat next to me, pointing out that Britney was sitting a dozen feet away at the kids' table. Britney looked at me and I smiled, sauce smeared across my lips and cheeks, and she laughed. My daughter took her sausage, dipped it in the sauce, and pressed it to her cheek, then gave me a big smile, now looking like me. We all laughed. "She's wonderful, Tommy," Don said, sitting back down at the table with a plate of food and a beer. "Thank you for agreeing to come today. I know it wasn't easy." I nodded and swallowed. He picked up another piece of meat, followed by a forkful of salad. Sarah looked at me and then at the others at the table. "Tommy is doing great today," she told everyone. "I've never seen him so conflicted, but at the same time so eager to get through it all." "Conflict?" Wanda asked. "What do you mean?" "I don't know how much you know about what happened to my cousin," Sarah said with a hint of anger in her voice, placing her hand on mine. I didn't even flinch, which surprised me. Her hand seemed so warm, so supportive. Her anger surprised me when she turned to Sheila's parents. Suddenly, she blurted out, "Sorry, Aunt Carrie and Uncle Don, but she deserved everything that happened to her." Sarah turned to me again and caught my eye, to which I nodded subtly. She looked around and noticed that most of the family were out of earshot and keeping their children away from us. This was obviously arranged in advance so that we could talk. Her suppressed anger was all too obvious as she continued to say, "Sheila drugged and brutally restrained Tommy, tying him to her bed. What she did was a desecration of everything she had ever professed to be love." The four elderly people looked shocked. I cried silently as I looked at my half-eaten plate of food. Emotions began to overwhelm me. I began to feel very nauseous. "Sarah," Carrie said, not believing her own daughter could do such a thing. Of course, things couldn't be that bad. I mean, yes, she went to jail, but the girl I gave birth to and raised couldn't have done something that terrible. It just doesn't fit in my head. "No, Aunt Carrie, I can't wrap my head around it, but it happened." Sarah looked at me, anger still burning in her eyes. Then she raised her hand to my cheek, the most intimate gesture anyone outside of Britney or my mother had given me in years. "Tommy, I know this is hard," Sarah said softly, "but I want them to understand that I understand. Can you show them like you showed me?" Her touch on my face was warm again and brought me back from the edge of the abyss on which I was teetering. I nodded my head absent-mindedly and unbuttoned the cuffs of my shirt. Despite the hot day, I never wore short sleeves outside the house. When I rolled up my sleeves and showed them the terrible scars on my arms, all four of them gasped. "No," Carrie whispered. "No," she said again, soon burying her head in Dawn's shoulder. Sarah leaned over and helped me roll up my sleeves and button the buttons. "Thank you, Tommy," she said, and turned to her family. "Every word is true. Sheila got pregnant the night she stole Tommy's. Innocence. He fights what was done to him every day. He gets up every day to take care of Britney. He holds an important position in the IT department at QPS head office, but every day is a struggle. He agreed to come today, even though I know he would rather be anywhere but here, being reminded of her or having this conversation." She took a deep breath. "I never said anything before, but Sheila damaged him so badly that the day we first met, he had a nervous breakdown when he thought I was her. But despite all this, he is here. Please respect that. He." She paused and looked at me. There was something in her gaze that I had never seen before as she put her hand on my arm. "He's special to me," she finished the sentence. Suddenly, everyone had surprised expressions on their faces, even their jaws dropped, including mine. Sarah suddenly looked like a fish out of water too. "No, wait," she said. I want to help Tommy. My cousin broke it, and over the past few months, I have gotten to know it. Initially, I just wanted to understand why he reacted to me the way he did, but then it became a strong desire to help him and Britney. Now he has become a friend, a close friend, and I want to help even more." No one said anything, and then everyone except me smiled, and then burst into soft laughter at her strong statement. Carrie stood up, walked around the table, and hugged me as I stood up. At first, I didn't know what to do, but then she pulled away, holding me at arm's length with an expression full of both sadness and joy. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she almost choked as she said, "I'm so sorry my daughter did this to you, Tommy, and I'm sorry if my reaction earlier made you feel terrible. It's hard to reconcile the girl I raised with what she did. But know that you and Britney will always find a safe place with us. We will never judge you, and if it allows us to keep our granddaughter in our lives, we will never mention my daughter to Britney or you again." It was a sincere plea, and I accepted her offer as favorably as I could. Then we sat down and talked some more. They told me their story, explaining that Sheila had asked them not to attend the trial and that she would serve her time on her own. They could write letters, but that was all. Carrie and Dawn were initially shocked, but due to the severity of the crimes charged, Sheila banned them from the courtroom when, against her wishes, they tried to attend to support their daughter. When she was convicted and sent to prison, she refused to see them. She wrote letters but did not receive visitors. In the letters, she explained that she needed to serve time for her crimes, but since all the records were sealed, they did not know all the details of what their daughter had done. In one of her letters, she mentioned that she would not write for a while because she was preparing for the birth of her child. But a month later, they received notification that Sheila had died in childbirth. After receiving notification, her parents mourned the loss for several months. Until last week, they thought their grandson died with Sheila, and until an hour ago, they had no idea how badly their daughter had screwed things up. After a difficult, but in some ways enjoyable day, we headed home. Britney chatted for a while, but quickly fell asleep. Sarah didn't say anything, and even though I knew she wanted to ask a lot of different questions, she just let me ride in silence. Over the next 3 months, Carrie and Dawn visited 3 times to spend time with Britney. They met my parents, and the two elderly couples spent several hours discussing the tragedy that had occurred. During these conversations, Sarah always walked with Britney outside, allowing the older couple to discuss their pain. My parents experienced the trauma with me. However, it was still fresh for Carrie and Dawn. Carrie herself often left in tears. I let her hug me, and over time she almost became a second mother to me, as she constantly showed concern for me. This became more than apparent at the next family meeting 3 months later. Sarah and I also became closer, and I have to admit that I sometimes wondered if there was more to it than just friendship. My problem was that I was torn between two thoughts. I broke up with Sheila because I never felt that spark of connection. But when I looked at Sarah, it was obvious to everyone, even to me and Sarah herself, that there is something between us. But she was Sheila's cousin, and I was afraid to take the next step. I mean, what if I screw it up? She quickly became my best friend, my confidant, and she practically became a mother to Britney. I couldn't afford to lose it. This time, the meeting was held at Carrie and Dawn's. They lived a few hours away on the other side of town, and again Sarah came with us. I wasn't as nervous as last time, and Britney was excited to meet the kids, telling us how she was going to play tag, watch movies, and eat 3 bowls of ice cream. We parked and walked to Carrie and Dawn's house, a large Queenslander-style house. Queensland homes are a specific style of home designed for the Australian climate. They are usually one-story houses with a large veranda that extends around the entire house. They stand on stilts to provide ventilation during the summer months, or in some cases, to raise the house above known flood levels. Carrie and Dawn bought the house just a few years ago, viewing it as an investment as their children got older and started families. Sheila was the third child of 4. She had 2 older brothers and 1 younger. I've learned over the last few months, as Carrie and Dawn became more comfortable talking to me, that Terry and Roger, the eldest 2, are already married with several children, and their youngest, Dominic, is dating a special girl they hope to someday accept into your family. With my permission, they explained some of Britney's and my story to their children, believing that Sheila's siblings should know, to some extent, what their sister had done and why she was in prison. In turn, I asked them to be patient with me. I didn't want everyone to know, but Britney's aunts and uncles needed to know enough to understand that Britney and I would be involved in their lives. At the door, Carrie and Donna, Sarah and Britney helped me do a couple of breathing exercises. I was much less nervous than when I first met. I met most of the family, and they were respectful and friendly. No, apart from my usual fear of being around people, I was about to meet Roger and Dominic for the first time. I met Terry and Roger's wife briefly last time, but Roger and Dominic were unable to attend the last meeting. However, I hoped that, knowing part of the story, they would support me and Britney. As soon as we walked through the door, Britney squealed as Carrie leaned in for a hug, and my daughter rushed to her grandmother. Sarah hugged her parents, and I hugged Wanda, who asked how I was doing. I only met Sarah's mother twice. She came to go shopping with Sarah one Saturday last month, and mother and daughter stopped by to bring Britney some clothes. One of the dresses my daughter proudly wore this afternoon. Glancing at me, Britney did a polite pirouette for Wanda and Carrie, both of whom applauded and admired how mature and beautiful she looked. With Sarah by my side, we all walked out into the backyard where I almost stopped, turned around, and decided to drive home. There were almost 50 adults in the garden, not to mention what looked like 30 children. My sudden stop and panicked expression seemed to be noticeable as Sarah took 2 steps forward before she realized I had stopped. She turned and caught my worried gaze. Walking up to me and taking my hands in hers, she said, "Tommy, look at me," drawing my eyes to hers. "It's okay, I'm with you," she assured me, using the phrase she started using every time I was on the verge of a panic attack. "This is family, you've already met some of them, and no one is going to hurt you or Britney, okay?" With these words, she took both my hands in hers and stood waiting for me. Carrie and Wanda were also nearby. Carrie held her sister's hand. Having seen my 2 attacks, she knew what to expect. But this was the first time Wanda saw it. However, her sister held her tightly. I breathed a few deep breaths and began to move my fingers along Sarah's arms. There are several ways to cope with anxiety or panic attacks. Different things work for different people or situations. Some people count, others fixate on the horizon, but what has often helped me is understanding the texture of the things around me. With Sarah's hands in mine, I focused on my fingertips and felt the texture of her hands. Sarah had soft hands. They were both soft and gentle, and I could feel a little moisturizer where her fingers touched mine. Her palms were pressed against mine, and as I breathed, I could almost feel the pulse of her circulation at that moment. "Thank you," I said, calming down. Sarah smiled at me and did not let go of my hand as we sat down at the table under the large canopy that had been set up for the evening. Carrie and Wanda sat with us for a few minutes, and after making sure I was calm and that Sarah wasn't going to leave me, they informed us that they would be in the kitchen helping prepare the food, but that if I needed anything they would be there. Britney went to play with the children, and several of her distant relatives whom she remembered from the previous time invited her to play. She never went far, and as always, came back every few minutes to check on me. Terry and Roger, along with their wives, Frida and Sam, came and sat with us for a while, about 15 minutes after we arrived. I almost felt like the elephant in the room because of what wasn't being said. But after a few minutes, they let me know that they had spoken to their partners, and they were all sad but wanted to apologize for their sister's behavior. They assured me that Britney and I are family and always will be. As an older brother, I appreciated this vote of confidence. As the evening went on, I felt more and more relaxed. Apparently, many family members now had some idea of what had happened to me. I was looked at several times, but no one except my immediate family told me anything about Sheila or what had happened. I was enjoying a smoky pizza made by Sarah's brother Craig and had just cuddled with Britney while Sarah went to the bathroom when my evening went awry. Sarah had apologized a few minutes earlier for drinking too much punch and pointed out that Carrie was nearby, within sight. I felt comfortable enough to smile and nod without feeling any real panic on the horizon. Britney came up to me for her usual hug and had just run away when Dominic decided to show up drunk and introduce himself. Apparently, Sheila's little brother had been at a bachelor party the night before, got drunk to the point of falling over, and then, when he woke up, drank again until his girlfriend, Hannah, picked him up. She wanted to take him home and let him sleep it off, but Dominic insisted that they attend the family party. "So, is this the little cuckold who couldn't handle my sister?" Dominic said in an arrogant, slightly slurred voice, approaching me. I tried to swallow, but it got stuck in my throat as I stared at him. He was several years younger than me, but was strongly built. According to Dawn and Carrie, their youngest son worked in a warehouse doing very physical work. Even drunk, he could easily beat me up. I forced myself to swallow and tried not to choke. "What?" I said, my voice almost a whisper as I felt my right hand begin to shake. I quickly put it under the table on my leg. Dominic noticed this and smiled wryly. "You heard me somersault," said the drunken brother. "I asked if you were a pathetic excuse for the man my sister had and caused her to die in prison." "Dominic," Carrie screamed when she noticed that her son was beginning to torment me. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Dominic looked at his mother for a moment. Her voice carried across the yard and attracted everyone's attention. However, Dominic did not notice at all that he was the center of attention. "What? Mom, I'm just getting to know you. I mean, tomboy." Even his own mother felt this drunken attitude. Carrie's eyes narrowed and her nostrils flared slightly. She looked at me, seeing the panic in my eyes and my nervous hand. "Dominic Jonathan," Carrie scolded. "Apologize immediately." "Or what?" he said, narrowing his eyes. Carrie looked at her son. "You're not so big that I can't handle you." Dominic laughed. "Don't fool yourself, Mom," he said haughtily. "I've been too big for you to handle for many years now. Of all of us, I'm the fittest, the strongest, and—" He suddenly reached out and hit me in the face with a lightning strike. It hit me on the cheek and split my lip. My head snapped back, sending me flying backwards over the chair. "The fastest," he finished telling his mother, and then looked at me. "It was for my sister. She died because of you." I lay on the ground, stunned by the blow. I didn't know what to do except run away and never go near that family again. But then, out of nowhere, a blonde woman rushed at Dominic and started beating him. Britney ran right up to him and started pounding him with her tiny fists. "Don't hurt me." "To my daddy," she screamed as we were all stunned. Dominic endured it for about 5 seconds, and then, without any effort, began to lift Britney by the collar of her dress. When he did that, my reflexes kicked in, and I jumped up and attacked the guy before he did anything to actually hurt my daughter. I screamed with a primal scream. Perhaps I am a weakling, perhaps, by some people's definition, a cuckold. But I was a father no matter what. Anything. Britney was the most important thing in the world to me. I walked up under his arms, and he immediately dropped Britney to try and grab me. I had no more shape than a skinny guy. But Dominic was in good shape, drunk, and had probably been in a fight or two while drunk, as evidenced by the elbow to my ribs before we even finished hitting the ground. Before I knew it, I was on my back with his fists, hitting me in the face. "You think you're a tough motherfucker," he yelled at me. "I'm going to end you right now so you can apologize to my sister." Carrie was screaming at Dominic to stop, and I could feel the movement of other people moving towards us. I just needed to get a few more hits in before the others separated us. Then I'd grab Britney and Sarah, and we'd be out of here and never coming back. He had just thrown his 5th blow, a glancing blow that I managed to deflect away from my face with my left forearm, when Sarah's blurry figure appeared out of nowhere at full speed and knocked Dominic off my prone body. A moment later, Terry and Roger pinned their little brother to the ground, while Sarah, with a wild look in her eyes, grabbed Dominic and squeezed him. Terry and Roger said nothing, but held their brother tightly until he shouted, "Stop it," and added, "No." Realizing that there was no fight left in her drunken cousin, and knowing that he was now held tightly by Terry, Roger, and several others, Sarah immediately let go of him and turned to me, not even trying to pry the crying Britney away from my neck. I half sat with my arm around my daughter, trying to calm her down. Someone handed Sarah a napkin with ice chips, and she immediately applied it to my split lip. "Are you okay, Tommy?" she asked. trying to look into my eyes. Britney now had one arm around Sarah, but didn't let go of my right hand. I nodded. Everyone got excited, and we looked at Dominic. Guarded by her brothers, Carrie flew up to him and grabbed her son by the ear, dragging him towards the house. Don, who had just now left the house, as he was in the front yard inspecting the guests' cars, looked at me, then at his wife, who was dragging their son with the most terrible expression on her face, and his face became grim. Over the next hour, almost everyone came up and apologized for Dominic. It turned out that one of the relatives was a doctor, and he examined me, telling me that in the next few hours I would have a black eye and a couple of bruises on my body, but otherwise I would be fine. Britney and Sarah never left my side. Britney even refused ice cream. She told everyone that her dad needed her, and that was the end of the conversation. While Britney sat on my lap, Sarah held my left hand as if she was afraid that if she let go, I would disappear. A little later, Carrie and Dawn returned and sat next to each other. "We're so sorry, Tommy," Dawn said. "I saw Dominic and Hannah come in, but I didn't think anything of it. We were supposed to be here." I shook my head and smiled at the couple who had been so patient with my problems over the past months. "It's not your fault," I told them. "How could you know he would do this?" "That's not an excuse," Carrie said. "He's better than this. We all miss Sheila." She glanced at me, and I gave her a weak smile. "But that's no reason to take it out on you, drunk or not. What happened is in no way your fault. Sorry, Tommy, this is the second child of mine that has hurt you badly." It was a strange feeling. When Dominic started to lift Britney up, it was like the fog around my life lifted. Now, as a result of the beating, at least for now, much of the anxiety I had lived with for years suddenly faded into the background. "It's okay, Carrie," I told her. "At least this time I don't have to spend a week in the hospital," I chuckled. It was an attempt at a joke. However, the joke did not work. I knew I said the wrong thing as soon as it left my lips. Carrie just looked at me. I realized that at that moment she felt like a failed mother. "Damn," I blurted out. "Dad," Britney laughed, breaking the heavy mood. "Bad word." My daughter, so small, but already so wise. We all laughed, even Carrie. "Sorry, Carrie, that was insensitive," I told her. She shook her head. "It's okay, Tommy. I just don't know what I did wrong." "Nothing, Aunt Carrie," Sarah said, joining the conversation. Terry and Roger were right there, understanding what was happening. Dominic was drunk and shouldn't have come. No one could have predicted that he would attack Tommy. None of us talked about Sheila. "So what happened to Dominic?" Sarah asked after a few moments. "My brother took him home," Don said. "Hannah practically broke up with him as soon as we took him into the house, apologized for bringing him and left. He always acted like he could get away with anything," Don complained. "Now he will be on the sidelines of the family for a while. It's not a good position to be in, especially when your girlfriend just left you and you're renting a house from one of the other family members." We talked some more and then spent time with other relatives who expressed their concerns. It was strange that it took an incident like this and a beating for me to start to come out of my shell a little more. On the way home, Britney fell asleep almost immediately, tired from the day's events. When we got home, Sarah helped me put Britney to bed and then followed me into the kitchen where she grabbed a glass of juice before we sat down in the living room. "Are you sure you're okay?" she asked me, with concern on her face. "Yes," I nodded. Once he picked up Britney, nothing else mattered except protecting her. Sarah smiled. "Parental instinct is most important." I shrugged, and we fell silent for a while. "How are you?" I asked her, "with the speed with which you rushed at him." Sarah blushed. "On my way back from the bathroom, I picked up a cup of iced tea for us each when I heard you scream. I saw you both fall, and by the time he pinned you down, I was already running towards him with all my might." "Sarah?" I asked, feeling my heart begin to beat faster. "Tommy?" she replied, a blush slowly creeping up her neck. "Why do you spend so much time with Britney and me? I mean, you have your own friends, right? Are you saying you don't want me here?" she asked with a hint of resentment in her voice. No, I said immediately and firmly. No, I repeated in a softer tone. I was just surprised. Tommy, there was something new in her voice, this time when she said my name. Sarah, I answered her. Yes, she said to the unspoken question. I swallowed. She sat and waited. I looked at her and noticed how the blush became even deeper on her neck. I sought her hand and our fingers intertwined. I have looked into her eyes more than once since we met. However, this time when our eyes met, there was something more in them. The feeling of our fingers intertwined, connected at that moment, eyes and fingers, it was something that screamed intimacy. A second passed, then another, and it wasn't awkward, it was magical. But then she swallowed and tried to let go of my hand. In that brief moment, as her grip began to loosen, many thoughts ran through my head. Yes, she was Sheila's cousin, but in the long months since we met, Sarah had been exceptionally patient with me, there for me when I had anxiety attacks. She spent time with Britney, brought us food, and stayed when she could have easily spent time with her friends or even found a boyfriend. Boy, this word stuck in my head. Sarah and I never talked about her love life, and I think she was holding back because of my traumatic past. But I knew that this beautiful woman in front of me was lonely. I knew there was something between us, this spark, as I called it. Many months ago, she had called me special to her, and even when she tried to deny it, everyone, her parents, her aunt and uncle, even me, knew instinctively what she meant. Her fingers started to slide back in, and she was about to look away. No, she was more than special to me. Like Britney, Sarah made me want to be a better person when she was around. I struggled with depression and fears that constantly tried to break me. If I looked back, even before that first family meeting, Sarah was in my thoughts more often than not. Her sweet personality pulled my mind from the dark depths of the past into a brighter future. Her knuckles were already touching mine, and she began to withdraw her hand, nervously pulling at her hair, a habit of hers that I had come to know and love. Sarah was beautiful both inside and out. She was everything I wanted, everything I needed, the complete opposite of her cousin. Suddenly, I squeezed her knuckles tightly, not giving her a hand, and she looked at me again, and I saw in her eyes something that I suddenly realized I had been missing for a long time. Hope. I stood up, our fingers unclenched, but I did not let go of her hand. The moment was magical, but I wanted something more, something I hoped she was willing to give me. I pulled her towards me, and I saw how she squared her shoulders. Her neck was naked, vulnerable. But this was not what I wanted. Without a word, I led her down the hall to my bedroom. She was puzzled for a moment, but then seemed to encourage me to go faster. I pulled her into the room and, still holding her hand, closed the door so as not to wake Britney. My curtains were drawn, and the night light on my side of the bed was already on when we came face to face. For the first time in years, I felt excited by the presence of a real woman in front of me, and I saw that Sarah was excited too. I could almost smell her desire thick in the air. Nothing was said as I let go of her hand and turned her back to me so I could see the buttons on the back of her summer dress. Sarah was wearing a black lace bra and black cotton panties. The sight of her magnificent body in all its glory made me hold my breath. As I gently kissed her bare neck, she raised her hands up, holding my lips on her neck. I was fascinated. Her eyes spoke of her desire and passion, but she wanted to make sure that I wanted it too. Apparently, she saw what she wanted, because the next moment Sarah began to bend over, slowly pulling the last thing she was wearing down her legs, showing me everything. I don't know how it happened, but the next moment I was as naked as she was and plunged into her. We collapsed on the bed, exhausted, and I rolled onto my back while Sarah snuggled against my side, resting her head on my shoulder. "Are you okay?" she asked me. I nodded. "Yes," I said hoarsely. "Sarah, I." When I hesitated, she misunderstood. "Tommy, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." I put my finger to her lips and grinned. "No, Sarah, it was amazing," I told her, and she relaxed. I mean, I didn't know sex could be like this, could bring such joy, such happiness. It was the most amazing thing I've ever done. "Is it true?" she asked, with hope in her eyes. "True," I replied, nodding. She screamed and kissed me, so I pulled her towards me and kissed her back. Then she felt something and, looking down and then back at my face, raised an eyebrow. We were awakened the next morning by Britney opening the door and discovering that Sarah and I were sleeping. We repeated this 3 more times that night. Our last copulation ended as light began to leak into the sky. We showered and put on pajamas, as I told Sarah most often. Britney would come and snuggle with us for a few minutes, usually a little after 7 in the morning. Britney climbed into bed, still sleepy, carrying her stuffed rabbit, and hugged me until she suddenly realized we weren't alone in bed. She screamed when she saw it was Sarah. "Sarah," my daughter said excitedly. Her bouncing up and down made me open my eyes. Sarah was lying there too, with a huge smile on her face as she saw the excited little girl. "Hi, sweetie," Sarah croaked. "Are you staying?" Brittany asked when she suddenly stopped bouncing. Sarah looked at me and I smiled. Sarah nodded. "Yay, I'm happy," Brittany said suddenly, standing up and turning her bunny around before collapsing on the bed and looking at us both. "Daddy needs you to love him," she said suddenly. The L word took me by surprise. "Yes, Brittany," Sarah replied, and my daughter nodded as if it were a truism. "And Daddy," Brittany said, looking at me. "Sarah also needs you to love her, just like you love me." I looked at my daughter, then at the woman who had given me so much, including herself, over the past months, but even more since last night. I reached for Sarah's hand in front of Brittany. "I love Brittany," I told her. Brittany giggled. "Well, you're married now, my mom and dad." Sarah and I looked at each other for a moment. "Brittany," Sarah said softly, "your dad and I'm not married." "But you said yes," Brittany told us in surprise. "I asked you and you said yes. And you are here, Sarah, here with Dad." I laughed and sat up, pulling Brittany to me and hugging her tightly. "It's okay, honey," I told her. "Sarah and I still have to talk, but you're right, we really love each other. And maybe we'll get married." I looked at Sarah, who was beaming. "How about," I said, holding Brittany close to me, "all 3 of us get dressed now and go to breakfast?" The scream Brittany let out was almost louder than when she found Sarah sleeping in the same bed as me. We've only gone out to eat a few times since Brittany was a baby, usually with my parents on special occasions like mine or Brittany's birthdays. The fact that I so calmly suggested going out was unheard of and brought more joy to my daughter than Christmas. Finally, we got up, got dressed, and all 3 of us got into my car. Sarah directed us to a cafe that was about 15 minutes away. Ordering breakfast made me feel loved. First by Brittany, who had not stopped smiling from the moment she found Sarah with me this morning. And then there was Sarah. If she wasn't drinking the coffee she needed after a sleepless night, she would look dreamily into my eyes. She constantly held my hand and leaned in for quick kisses, which caused Brittany indescribable joy and laughter. Finally, there was me. I realized that since yesterday, most of what was bothering me had faded somewhat into the background. Of course, these were only the first days, and yes, my problems still remained. I still sat with my back to the wall, but I was surprised by the lack of fear. We returned home shortly after lunch, and Brittany went to take a nap. Sarah kissed me and said she needed to change, but asked if she could stay the night. Of course, I said no. PFFT, of course, I said that it was possible. I wanted her to always be there, and, of course, in my bed. When we went to our next family meeting, I took my parents with me. They spent a lot of time with Carrie and Dawn, and everyone quickly realized that Sarah and I were now a couple. Wanda smiled from ear to ear, saying it was long overdue. That night in bed, Sarah and I exchanged the words, "I love you," for the first time. We were watching an episode of a TV show we liked, and she snuggled up to me. After we turned off the light, I hugged her and told her I loved her. These words somehow came out on their own, but I didn't regret it, because Sarah didn't make a big deal out of it. She just said that she loved me too, and that was that. Everyone at work quickly noticed that I was happier, and my psychologist was also pleased that I had found love that brought me satisfaction. It was a surprise that it was Sheila's cousin, but we discussed it and agreed that as long as I didn't hold a grudge against Sarah for what her cousin did, there was nothing wrong with it. 6 months later, I returned from work to find Sarah very depressed. She picked Britney up from daycare for me and has been doing this more and more lately. But this evening, she was irritable and rude to us. "Sarah, what's wrong, honey? Is something wrong?" I asked her when I put Britney to bed. "It's okay, Tommy," she snapped back. It had been a long time since she had spoken like that, but the tone brought back memories of Sheila. I swallowed. "I don't believe it, Sarah," I said, feeling like I was risking my life. "You've been in a bad mood all week, and today you almost yelled at Britney when she offered to take your plate to the kitchen. She just wanted to help." "I know that." She paused, then sighed. "Listen, I'm sorry, Tommy, but apparently I'm not in a good mood. It's because of the new manager. He's pushing us faster and faster, and in some ways it seems like he's been picking on me the last few days." She sat down next to me and pressed herself close to me. "I'm sorry, honey," she told me. "I didn't realize I was such a bitch." "It's okay," I replied. "I just don't want you to make Britney think she did something wrong." She didn't say anything for a moment, and tears welled up in her eyes. "You too," Sarah added quietly. "Sorry," I replied when I heard her, but there was still some tone in her voice. Sarah sighed again, sat up, and looked at me. "I said you too. You don't want me to snap or be a bitch to you." "I didn't say that," I said. "But you meant it," she said accusingly. "No, I didn't," I shook my head. "What I meant was that Britney. She loves you, and she was upset that you told her off for offering to help. What are you talking about?" Sarah suddenly said with irritation. "Nothing," I said, and my protective barriers, which had not appeared for months, rose again. "No, Tommy," Sarah said suddenly, standing up, her hands on her hips, her nostrils flaring. Tell me what a bitch I've been to your daughter. Tell me how bad I've been to you both all this time." I didn't say anything, not understanding where it came from. Sarah and I were happy until this week. I mean, we've been talking about getting married next year, maybe having a baby soon after that. And yes, I still had anxiety attacks occasionally, but they were fewer and farther between, and Sarah always helped me cope with them. "Listen," I said, trying to calm the situation. "Sorry, Sheila, but you've been so stressed out with work and all this with Damien, Darren, David. I just don't want you to." Sarah's scream caught me off guard, and my anxiety returned in full force as she attacked me with thunder in her voice. "I'm not that bitch, Tommy," she screamed. "I am not the woman who offended you, who took away your innocence. I'm the one who helped you, stood next to you." I know," I said, raising my hands, suddenly realizing that I had called her Sheila. "Sorry," I said quietly. "You're sorry, Tommy. Stop apologizing. Just accept it," Sarah accused me, thunder in her voice. "Why don't you grow up?" Stunned, I said nothing. Sarah continued to look at me with anger. "What, you won't say anything? Are you just going to sit here and withdraw into yourself? I can see it, Tommy. Even now you're withdrawing into yourself and don't care about Darren. Remember his name and listen," she hissed. Then she stopped. "You know what? To hell with it. It's not worth the hassle. I'll deal with Darren tomorrow," she said, and I just sat there, not moving anymore. Sarah didn't know, but in her anger she had unwittingly given me a massive anxiety attack, and I was paralyzed. "I'm going to bed," she said and left. I sat there, my mind racing, adrenaline filling my system, but I couldn't move. My breathing became short, as if a lump in my throat was preventing me from screaming for help. Who could I call? Sarah had just left and Britney was asleep in her bed. I probably sat there for almost 20 minutes, trying to force myself to move. I tried to touch things around me to feel them. I tried to count, but it didn't help. I couldn't calm my breathing to establish any kind of regular rhythm. I just sat there and my mind started to wander, wandering into dangerous places. Why did Sarah attack me over such a small thing? I didn't attack her. I couldn't, and I didn't want to. I loved her so much. I just wanted to discuss the elephant in the room, that Britney was a little upset that Sarah was rude to her when she was just trying to help. I mean, this Darren guy at work obviously really hit her hard and hurt her deeply. But maybe there is something else. Then a dark thought appeared in my head. What if he got more? I mean, Sarah is a beautiful woman, and of course a strong guy who shows interest in her would have a chance. What if her frustration with me being a broken Tommy led her to another man? What if she cheats on me? What if Darren has already seduced her and her irritation is directed at me because of my shortcomings? I sat there for a long time, unable to move, worried that the woman I loved, the person who had helped me so much, no longer felt the same way about me. What if I'm just a charity case to her, someone who needs fixing, and the better I get, the less she wants to be around me? I rocked back and forth slowly. I think this went on for almost an hour before Sarah came back downstairs in her robe. When she entered the living room, she said, "Tommy, are you going to bed or—" Suddenly Sarah gasped as she saw me sitting there, rocking in an almost catatonic state. I could move my eyes, but my arms and legs were still practically paralyzed. "Tommy, Tommy," she repeated. "No, no, 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 no." Sarah immediately sat next to me, phone in one hand, calling for an ambulance, and the other clutching my hand, tears streaming down her face. "I'm with you, Tommy. I love you so much. I'm so sorry. The ambulance is on the way." Sarah followed the ambulance, taking a sleepy Britney with her. All three of us spent the next 2 hours in the emergency room waiting for the doctor. The doctors quickly confirmed that I was having a serious anxiety attack, checked my medications against the data, and gave me a large dose of medication before finally releasing me so Sarah could take me home. Arriving home, Sarah put Britney to bed and then slid into bed next to me. "I'm so sorry, Tommy. I don't know what came over me," she said as we settled into bed. I still felt a little lost. Doubly so, because tonight knocked Sarah off the pedestal I had kept her on, and I thought I had lost her forever. Finally, I managed to quietly whisper, "It's okay, Sarah." She shook her head. "No, it's not okay," she said. I felt terrible even when I uttered those evil words. "I knew you weren't attacking me. You were just trying to help me, and I threw it in your face. What's wrong with me?" I waited, realizing that she needed to speak before falling asleep. "You were right, honey," she told me. "I was a bitch, and it wasn't fair to you. It wasn't fair to Britney either. I love you both. Yes, Darren bugs me at work, but something else is wrong. Can you forgive me?" I thought for a moment. We had just returned from the hospital, and I didn't want to go back there again. "So, nothing's going on with this Darren guy at work?" I finally asked. For a moment, I saw her face change emotions in the moonlight. Surprise, anger, then concern, and finally fear. "Oh God, Tommy. No, how could you think that? I don't like him, I don't even hate him, but we don't get along. I do not and will not have any sexual relations with him." I felt like she saw that I had relaxed. I heard a quiet sob. "Is that what you were thinking, sitting down there, while I was being stupid here? That my irritation is due to the fact that I'm cheating on you?" I didn't say anything, and she does too. "Tommy, honey," she said softly and with love in her voice, "since the day we met, when you yelled at me, there has been no one in my heart but you." We both laughed, remembering that moment. "No one, and I mean no one, I love more than you. And Tommy, I have no desire, sexual, romantic, or otherwise, for anyone else. I wish I could tell you why I'm acting so strange, but I don't know myself. Please, darling, please believe me. Please forgive me." I smiled at my girlfriend. "I forgive you." We kissed and fell asleep in each other's arms. We were both still nervous, but together. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of Sarah dry vomiting in the toilet. "Damn, Tommy, I must have eaten something wrong. I feel terrible," she said as I walked into the bathroom. I patted her on the back, and suddenly a thought occurred to me. "Sarah?" I asked, and she looked at me, although her face was pale. "Yes," she answered. I'm not sure. but I have mood swings and vomiting. Maybe you're, um, pregnant?" Sarah looked at me for a moment and then paled even more. I saw her counting the days in her head because she always took her birth control pills like clockwork. "Pregnant?" She tilted her head to the side. I nodded. She asked, looking at me. I nodded again. "Tommy, what if? What if it's true? What if or rather, we are expecting a child?" she asked with excitement. I smiled. "Honey, if that's the case, then Britney will be glad to have a brother or sister." I helped Sarah up and downstairs. We found Britney watching cartoons, oblivious to what was happening around her. After breakfast, at which Sarah only ate tea and toast, we went to the pharmacy to get some tests. We discussed everything that might happen for most of the rest of the day. The next morning, Sarah walked into the bedroom. "Well?" I asked. She showed the test strip. Positive result. I smiled and Sarah fell into my arms. "You're going to be a mom," I told her, and when she looked at me, I added, "again." She squeezed my hand. "But Britney isn't mine." I snorted. "Biologically, maybe, but in every other way, you were her mom from the moment you convinced her to let you braid her hair." We lay in bed a little longer, gently touching her belly. "Are you happy, Tommy? Really happy?" Sarah asked me. "I mean, it all happened so fast." I pulled her towards me and kissed the top of her head. I knew Britney would be up soon, but she had already learned to cook her own breakfast. She would be 4 years old in 2 weeks, and she could make her own breakfast. "You know," I told her, "I'm happy." "Okay, then me too. I love you so much, Tommy." "I love you too, Sarah, you know," I said, hesitating. Sarah turned her head and looked at me. "What?" she asked. "Maybe we should get married, as quickly as possible before the baby is born," I suggested, not being sure that I wouldn't get into trouble. Sarah leaned forward, and I felt her breasts touch mine as she kissed me. "I would like that," she replied. "You and me, Mr. and Mrs., and our children. Family." We took Britney to daycare, and Sarah and I went to work. At lunch, we went to jewelry stores and chose a ring. It wasn't very expensive, but we both agreed we could afford it right away, so I bought it, hugged Sarah, asked her to marry me, and put the ring on her finger when she said yes. That evening, the whole family screamed with joy when we told our parents. Everyone was betting on when this would happen, but no one thought it would be so soon. Of course, we didn't tell them we were expecting a baby. We just said that we were going to get married. Brittany's 4th birthday was 2 weeks later, and Carrie and Dawn asked if they could host the party. They adored their granddaughter, and I agreed. Their backyard was decorated with play areas, bouncy castles, and lots of sweets and treats. The whole family was there except Dominic, who was still fighting. We also invited all of Brittany's friends from kindergarten. Even though it was a child's birthday, Craig took it upon himself to smoke the brisket for the family, and as the father of the birthday girl, I didn't mind. Sarah's brother knew a lot about barbecue, and I gladly accepted the plate of tender meat, grinning as my fiancée sat down next to her plate, making sounds that I usually heard in the bedroom. After eating and playing, Brittany excitedly opened her gifts. The toys pleased her, she accepted the money with respect, but her favorite gift was the one that took her a little time to understand. She opened the envelope, but could not read what was written there. "What does it say here, Dad?" she asked, handing me a piece of paper. I looked at Sarah, and she smiled. I helped Brittany sit between us. Everyone else, her friends and family, gathered around to listen. "It says here," I began, looking at the words on the laminated piece of paper, "that after 6 months you can exchange this voucher for a brother or sister." Gasps of amazement were heard. No one was surprised that Sarah and I were getting married, perhaps surprised that it was happening so quickly, but the event itself was not a surprise. However, as my words reached the adults around me, they waited for Brittany to understand what it meant. "Dad, what is little sister?" Brittany asked. Sarah put her hand on her stomach and turned to Brittany. "Brittany, this means that you will soon have a brother or sister. I will have a child." Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed my mom leaning on my dad while Carrie and Wanda were hugging. Britney was still trying to process what she had heard. She looked at Sarah, then at me, then back at Sarah's stomach, where her hand was resting. Carefully, Britney placed her hand on Sarah's stomach. "Sister," she asked quietly and looked at me. I nodded. "Yes, honey, sis," I said, hugging her. "Britney, you and I will have to help Mom take care of the new baby, and you will become a big sister." That's when she understood. Maybe she didn't yet fully understand the word sister, but big sister was clear to her, and she suddenly rushed to Sarah, hugging and kissing her, and then me. Then she was hugged by her grandmothers, aunts, uncles, and all her younger cousins. My mom hugged me tightly. "I'm so proud of you, Tommy," she told me. "Hey," I replied. "It's not me. Sarah does all the work. She's the one who raises the child inside herself." My father laughed. I heard him lovingly say the same thing to my mother several times growing up. "I know, Tommy," Mom smiled, "but you've been through so much. Having Sarah in your life has been such a wonderful blessing. We hoped from the very beginning that you and her would end up together, but marriage and a child so quickly is simply amazing. I always hoped." I stepped away from my mother and placed my hand on her shoulder. "I understand, Mom. Sheila." Mom looked at me when I said her name, because everyone, including her family, avoided mentioning her around me. I nodded. "Yes, Sheila, I'm starting to get used to saying her name without wanting to curl up in a ball. Sheila did something terrible, but she also gave me Britney and, in a sense, led me to Sarah. I don't see Sheila when I look at Britney or Sarah these days. I just see the two women I love. They've seen me at my worst, and they're both still around. I'm looking forward to Sarah and I getting married and having our own child. I want us all to become a real family. I want us, especially me, to finally get over what Sheila did." My mother hugged me tightly, and I was surprised when my father hugged me too. He was a real man who didn't like to show his soft side, but I accepted it and was glad. That evening at home, Brittany brought Sarah to tears when she asked if she could call Sarah Mom, now that she was a big sister, having heard me refer to Sarah that way earlier that day. Our wedding took place in Gary and Wanda's backyard. It was a small celebration attended mostly by family and a few close friends, including my boss, who has supported me for years. While Carrie and Dawn were busy with Brittany, Sarah and I spent a week in Melbourne. We watched several shows, ate our fill, and made love morning, noon, and night. When we got home, even though Brittany had a great time at her grandparents' house, she was happy to be with us again. But that evening, when we picked up our daughter, there was something sad about Carrie and Dawn that neither Sarah nor I could put our finger on. And yes, Brittany was our daughter. During the wedding, we signed an agreement that Sarah would officially adopt Brittany and not just be her stepmother. It took a while to become official, but we discussed it, and it was important to both of us. Sarah was the only real mother Brittany had ever known, and we wanted to make it official. The next week, we learned why Carrie and Dawn were sad when they, Gary, Wanda, and my parents arrived at our house on Saturday morning. "Tommy," Carrie said as we sat down in the living room. Wanda took Brittany out for a milkshake while the rest of us talked. I swallowed. I had a feeling that the conversation would not be pleasant. "You have given us more happiness than we could ever imagine by allowing us to be a part of your and Brittany's lives. We know that my daughter did something terrible and unforgivable to you. It took me a long time to accept the fact that she could do something like that. But no matter how hard it was for me, I know it was even worse for you." I nodded. Sarah sat next to me, holding my hand and listening to her aunt. "When Sarah first brought you to us," Carrie continued, "I saw you two and immediately knew you were meant for each other, and I prayed every Sunday in church that my daughter wouldn't ruin it." I smiled. Carrie took a slightly aged letter from her bag. I doubted whether we should even do this, but it was one of my daughter's last wishes. Carrie and I met our eyes, and I saw pain in them, partly reflecting my own pain. A mother forced to face the fact that one of her children committed the same crime as her is something she will have to carry with her all her days. Go on, I said, my voice cracking slightly. This is one of the last letters we received before she died. This letter comes sealed and is addressed to you. My daughter asked me to deliver it to you in 5 years. We didn't know how to do it, but we decided to try. However, then you came into our lives. We all thought, said Harry, jumping up, that we would come here to support you. We all talked about it and had no idea what the letter said, but we all wanted to be here for you. I looked around the room and saw all the people who had supported me over the years and those who had supported me since I found out about Britney. They all gave me unconditional love. None of them reproached me when I was rude or impudent to them. They gave me no problems when I had an unexplained panic attack. My hand trembled as I extended it for the letter. Would. I stopped and cleared my throat. Would you mind if I read this alone? Sarah leaned over and kissed me. Not at all, but we're here for you, okay? A few minutes later, Sarah, letter in hand, walked with me into our bedroom, kissed me, and told me that she had me, and they would all be waiting for me with everything I needed. She also let me know that she would come to see me in half an hour, but would leave me alone to read the letter. I kissed my wife, and when she stepped back and closed the door, I turned the letter over in my hands and settled down on the bed. It was a sealed envelope with my name on the front and the name and logo of the Department of Corrections on the back. I broke the seal and unfolded the letter, seeing the handwritten handwriting characteristic of Sheila's letter. I closed my eyes and did breathing exercises, running my fingers over the texture of the letter, feeling the slightly rough surface of the paper, the edge of the page, and the corner where the paper ended. Taking one last deep breath, opening my eyes, I read, Tommy, from the bottom of my heart, I am so sorry for what I did to you. You have never, ever deserved to be treated this way, and I understand that it is highly likely that you will throw this letter in the trash without ever opening it. But if by some miracle you are reading this, then I want to sincerely apologize. What I did was so wrong, and even so delusional that I knew in the depths of my being that I was hurting you. To be honest, no. I really understand that what we had was not love. In a way, it wasn't even lust. There were circumstances that you didn't know about, and I hope that through this letter you will understand them. I don't expect forgiveness, but if it helps you move forward, I'll tell you my own story of heartbreak. Before we get to that, Tommy, I need to tell you that I'm pregnant. But I hope that by the time you read this, you will understand that you will be raising our daughter on my behalf. I'll call her Britney. For obvious reasons, I cannot raise a child here, so I hope that after she is born, you will want to become a father to our daughter and not place her in the care of the state. I can't fully regret that night, Tommy. As terrible as it was for you, and although I know you wouldn't believe it when you think about it, I didn't want everything either. But we will have a daughter, and the maternal instinct in me, which grows as it approaches birth, cannot regret it. Tommy, there is a reason I did what I did, a reason I became obsessed with you, and time and counseling have shown me that it is not a valid reason, but it is a reason nonetheless. I have never mentioned this to anyone before, except the consultant here, and now in this letter. I was bullied several times in high school. He was a boy I liked, and we got along well. We took a few classes together, and in my teenage fantasies, I dreamed that we could date, get married, have kids, and grow old together. But I had the same thoughts about several boys. My cousin Sarah and I often told each other about the boys we liked and how we would marry them and become better wives and mothers. Our husbands would earn a lot of money working together, and we would love to kiss them. I know the stupid fantasies of teenage girls. Anyway, I liked this boy, and he realized I liked him and asked me out. At first, he was cute. We met, and he was respectful. But one night, he got me drunk, and I woke up in pain. I cried, and he apologized, saying that we were both drunk, and it happened. But he took something precious from me, and I felt dirty. Yes, I understand the irony, and that's part of this tragedy. We dated in the following months, but he forced me to sleep with him several times. His demands grew more and more, then he became rude, forced me to do things I didn't want, called me names and hurt me when he took me. But I was an unclean woman. By giving up, I felt I deserved his mistreatment. I was in a lot of pain, and Tommy, I had no idea what to do about it. But then fate intervened, and he died tragically in a car accident. For some reason, I was sad, but I was also free. My family knew I was sad about my classmate's death, but I never knew why I was so emotional. In response to this, I relaxed a bit for the rest of the year, sought boys' attention wherever I could, and gained some reputation. Then one day I got scared. My period was late, and I was scared that I might be pregnant, and that stopped me. No more scandalous meetings, flirting, etc. I came out in groups and was friendly, but that was about it. Before you. Tommy, when we met, I almost fainted. You were almost his exact copy. Your face, your build, the way you stood, the way you laughed. But unlike him, you were never cruel. Even when you told me that we weren't meant to be together, you tried to do it with kindness. Thank you. The night I ruined both of our lives was planned. My friends didn't know anything about it, but I became obsessed with you. You were too much like him, and he hurt me too much for me to let you go easily. He hurt me, that's why I needed you. I needed to control you, but make you mine because I was getting him back and showing him that I was better than him. The medications I gave you and took myself were just a mask for the pain I caused us both. And again, I'm sorry, especially since you've never done anything wrong. It was all on me, not you. I'll be here for a long time, but I'm afraid I've put you in prison too. Tommy, I hope this helped you. I hope that when you read this, Britney becomes a part of your life, that you find someone to love, and that this letter gives you closure. I will serve my time gratefully and will not contact you again unless you wish me to. Best regards, Sheila. When I finished the letter, tears were streaming down my face, not for me or my circumstances, but for Sheila. Her letter explained so many things and explained why she was such a tortured soul. It was like you were working on a jigsaw puzzle and you kept looking at several different pieces that you thought would fit, but you just couldn't find the right position until suddenly it made sense. No matter what, I could never understand why she did what she did, why Carrie, Dawn, and her family could not understand how she could act the way she did. Now I know. I knew the letter was true. There were no lies or deceit in it. After reading this, I was saddened that she never found out that she would die shortly after our daughter was born. I could never hold the love for Sheila in my heart, but I was surprised that I no longer hated her, but instead felt a deep sadness that she was treated the same, if not more, than I was. I read the letter again, stood up and walked out of the room into the living room to face my family. Sitting down, I took some time to explain what was in the letter, figuring that Sheila wouldn't be offended if I shared with her family what she had written to me. I held Carrie tightly as she cried, knowing that her daughter had gone through something that had broken her. When I handed her over to Dawn, she cried even more as Sarah hugged me and told me how proud she was of me. About 3 months after Samuel was born, Sarah and I took Britney and her little brother to Sheila's gravesite. Although her parents didn't take her ashes, they wanted a memorial, a place to visit their daughter. Sarah put down the bouquet of flowers and brushed the branches off the headstone. "Could you put this down?" I said, handing Britney the only rose without thorns. "This is your birth mother's resting place." She looked at me, not quite understanding, but put it aside and then moved on to Sarah. "We'll give you a few minutes," my wife told me. Touching my cheek gently, she took Britney's hand and held Samuel in the other. "Hi, Sheila," I said, addressing the grave in front of me. "I want to thank you for your letter. It helped a lot." My right hand, which had developed essential tremor, trembled slightly, and I reached out and touched its tombstone. "You'll be glad to know that I took Britney in after your death. It hasn't been easy, but our daughter has changed my life for the better. I probably couldn't have done it without her." Then I sat down and leaned my shoulder against her tombstone. "And I found love," I smiled, thinking about my wife. "I met Sarah and I was scared, thinking it was you coming back from the grave. I think that's what you thought of me. At first you thought I was Gordon." I glanced at her gravestone again, not expecting an answer, but waiting a moment nonetheless. Yes, we all understood who it was. Whatever it takes, I'm sorry for what he did to you. You didn't deserve it. But Sarah and I found the spark that you and I didn't have. After reading, part of me wanted your letter to be with us, but we both knew that it was not there. I stopped for another moment and looked up at the sky. It was a clear day, and the trees in the middle of the cemetery cast shadows, which made it a pleasant feeling as I sat here talking to Sheila. You would be very proud of Britney, Sheila. She's about to start school, and she's already reading and even writing a little. She calls Sarah Mom, and I hope that's okay. But when she grows up, we will also make sure that she knows about you. I hope you are at peace now, wherever you are. And I think there is only one thing left. Sheila. I held my breath for a moment. I forgive you. I sat for a moment, rested my head on her gravestone, and closed my eyes. It was probably my imagination, but it was like a gentle breeze that passed by and touched my cheek, giving me a feeling of warmth and satisfaction. Yes, maybe it's my imagination, but I'll take it. I promised that Sarah and I would bring Britney here several times over the next few years and stood there brushing the grass off my pants. My wife smiled at me, pulled me into her arms, and kissed me as I walked back to the car with my family. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked me. "Yes," I answered, looking back at Sheila's grave and smiling. "I really am." Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.